Self-Help is Like a Vaccine, Essays on Living Better. By Bryan Caplan. To Tyler Cowen, the big brother who has been helping me help myself for over 30 years. Part 1, Unilateral Action. Self-help is like a vaccine. AEI's Andrew Biggs has a totally reasonable piece arguing that Americans' unhealthy lifestyles are a major cause of America's high COVID mortality rate. Americans entered the COVID pandemic in much poorer health than citizens of other developed countries. For instance, over 27,000 U.S. COVID deaths list diabetes as a comorbidity, accounting for 16% of total COVID-related fatalities. But what if instead of having the highest diabetes rate among rich countries, the U.S. had the same rate as Australia, with less than half the U.S. level? The same holds for obesity, listed as a comorbidity in 4% of COVID cases. 40% of Americans are obese, the highest in the developed world and over twice the OECD average. U.S. death rates from heart disease are also higher than most European and Asian countries. Hypertension is listed as a comorbidity in 22% of COVID deaths. If Americans simply had the same health status as other high-income countries, it is likely that tens of thousands of lives could have been saved. The obvious upshot is, individuals can and should reduce their COVID risk by switching to healthier lifestyles. Yet Biggs strangely declares the opposite. General practitioners tell me that their type 2 diabetes patients can tell you their weight and know how it relates to their illness. They know that by losing weight they can reduce their risk of blindness, limb amputations, or death. They simply aren't able to do it. If anything is obvious, however, it is that they simply are able to do it. Anyone can. Eat fewer and smaller meals and you will lose weight. Exercise more and you will lose weight. Everyone knows this, and everyone can apply their knowledge. Put less food in your mouth, move your body more, and your risk of dying of COVID will crash. Why then do so many people remain unhealthy, even in the midst of a historic pandemic? Because they prefer the pleasure of food and idleness plus the attendant health loss, to the pain of hunger and exertion plus the attendant health gain. To quote Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman, "I always knew what the right path was. Without exception, I knew. But I never took it. You know why? It was too damn hard." If this is all undeniable, why do so many smart people refuse to assent? Social desirability bias, naturally. When the truth sounds bad, people say and perhaps even believe the patently untrue. As I've explained before. "Sorry, I can't come to your party." This common excuse is almost always literally false. You're working? Unless your boss chains you to your desk, you can come to the party. You're in Paris, and the party's in DC tomorrow? If you can beg, borrow, or steal airfare, you can come to the party. The same goes for most social uses of the word can't. Everything from, "we can't be together," to, "I can't help myself." Why say, "I can't," when the truth is, "it's too costly for me," or, "I don't feel like it"? Because "I can't" sounds better. It insinuates, the only reason I'm not doing X is because I lack the ability to do X. Otherwise, I would totally do it. "It's too costly for me," and "I don't feel like it," are insulting by comparison. Both blurt, "X simply isn't my top priority." Get used to it. In short, the way we use the word can't is a clear-cut case of social desirability bias. Our all-too-human propensity to lie when the truth sounds bad. The literally false can't is hardly alone. Social desirability bias permeates our diction, i.e., the specific words we choose to use. What's so awful about sugarcoating the harsh reality that the obese are fully capable of reaching a healthy body weight? Simple. Sugarcoating distracts and confuses. Self-help is a virtually foolproof solution for obesity. As long as you strictly follow the recipe, you won't be obese for long. Ignoring or denying the possibility of self-help discourages people from fixing or even saving their own lives. One could scoff, human beings are weak. What's the point of telling them to diet and exercise for the rest of their lives when we know they won't? We might as well just spare their feelings. Perhaps. Consider, though, this parallel argument. Anti-vaxxers are crazy. What's the point of telling them to get vaccinated when we know they won't? We might as well just spare their feelings. Can you think of any decent objections? Because I definitely can. There's a continuum of crazy. Some anti-vaxxers are beyond hope. Others will only bend the knee in the face of overwhelming shame. A great many, however, are only skin-deep crazy. Moderate shame or persistent persuasion will eventually get the vaccines in their bloodstreams. 2. Crazy is contagious. If no one challenges anti-vaxxers, undecided bystanders are more likely to adopt their crazy ideas. These converts, in turn, can easily go on to corrupt others. Given how conformist human beings are, the anti-vax movement can spread even in the absence of deliberate recruitment efforts. Initially, non-crazy people notice the rising prevalence of crazy ideas and casually become crazy themselves. 3. Someone's gonna get blamed. If you refuse to blame anti-vaxxers for their own bad choices, people are likely to look around for someone else to blame. For example, people would probably be happy to take vaccines if doctors weren't so arrogant. The result? Instead of sparing people's feelings in the aggregate, you wind up redistributing the hurt feelings over to innocent bystanders. What then is the right message to send? This: anti-vaxxers are totally able to get vaccinated. They are making bad choices. They should make better choices. This isn't merely helpful, it is true. The same goes for obesity. The right message is not: they are simply unable to lose weight. The right message is: the obese are totally able to be thin. They are making bad choices. They should make better choices. This isn't merely helpful, it is true. The same principle holds for self-help generally. Self-help is like a vaccine. When used, it works wonders. The fact that many people refuse to do what works is a flimsy reason to humor them. And it is a terrible reason to endorse clear-cut errors like, they just can't do it. Anyone can get vaccinated. Just roll up your sleeve and let the doctor stick you with the needle. Anyone can be thin. Just eat moderately and exercise regularly. And anyone can improve his own life. Just stop making excuses and follow the path of prudence. September 30, 2020. Say Cant with care. Suppose a student fails a math test. Casual observers will often announce, he can't do the math. Or suppose a country has a horrible corruption problem. Casual observers will often announce, the government can't solve this corruption problem. In each case, I detect a casual logical fallacy. Namely, if person X actually does Y, we can legitimately infer, X can do Y. But if person X does not do Y, you cannot legitimately infer that they can't. Maybe they don't do Y because they can't do Y, maybe they don't do Y because they choose not to do Y. What's the real story? Figuring that out requires further investigation. Before you declare that X can't do Y, start with this simple checklist. Step 1. See if the actor in question even tried to do Y. Step 2. If the actor tried, examine how hard he tried. Step 3. Look at how successful comparably able actors are when they try their very hardest. Thus, before you say that a kid who fails a math test can't do it, you should examine A. Whether he even tried to pass, B. If so, how hard he tried, and C. The pass rate for comparable students who try their very hardest. Similarly, before you say that a country can't solve its corruption problem, you should examine A. Whether the country even tried to do so, B. If so, how hard it tried, and C. The success rate for comparable countries that try their very hardest. You could respond, running such an investigation sounds awfully difficult. How do we know whether someone tried? How hard they tried? How do we find comparable actors? How do we know whether the comparable actors tried their very hardest? I fully agree. Knowing what someone can't do tends to be hard. Which is precisely why you should make such claims with care. The most egregious misuses of can't, however, come when even token efforts reliably produce success. When someone says, he can't stop drinking, or, he can't stop cheating, common sense revolts. Maybe you aren't smart enough to pass a math test. But what skill does it take not to consume a beverage? To abstain from sex? Just don't do it, and it is done. January 15, 2020. My Life of Appeasement. Morally speaking, I think taxation is theft. The government has a lot of bad excuses for taking my money without my consent, but no really good reasons. Still, every year, I pay my taxes. Why don't I stand up for my rights? The obvious reason, If I stood up for my rights by refusing to pay and attacking anyone who tried to make me, I would end up dead or in jail. That's the way the government deals with tax resistors. Given this bleak forecast, I never openly defy the government. Instead, I practice the opposite strategy, appeasement. I find out what the government demands, I comply, and I resume living my rich, fulfilling life. Yes, my rights have been violated. But I'd rather live on my knees than die on my feet. Indeed, I would consider dying on my feet to be not only foolish but wicked. Life is a gift, even if the government insists on tarnishing it. Didn't the Munich Agreement prove for all time that appeasement doesn't work? Hardly. Despite its well-hyped failures, appeasement is an incredibly effective social strategy for dealing with the unreasonable and the unjust, also known as 90% of mankind. Whenever someone makes bizarre demands upon me, my default is not to argue. Instead, I weigh the cost of compliance. If that cost is small, and it usually is, I let the babies have their way. If you bump into me in the grocery store, I say sorry. Doesn't that open the floodgates to additional demands? Not in my experience. One symbolic gesture is enough to placate most of the unpleasant characters I encounter. After my concession, we usually go our separate ways. And even when I repeatedly interact with the same unreasonable, unjust person, at least my appeasement makes it hard for them to imagine that they have to get back at me for my past wrongs. Despite their scorn, almost everyone knows that appeasement works. How do I know this? Because everyone appeases to cope with social realities. Recall your day. Did you experience some unreasonable, unjust treatment? Probably. If so, did you escalate the conflict until reason and justice prevailed? Probably not. Why not? Because it would be a Pyrrhic victory, likely to leave you unemployed and alone. Once people retract the absurd claim that appeasement doesn't work, they finally unveil their real objection. They have too much pride to appease. Why should I apologize when she's the one who stepped on my foot? When people express such attitudes, I usually just appease them and get on with my life. But what I'm silently thinking is, if you're truly awesome, you shouldn't care what unreasonable, unjust people think. Does this mean that you should never stand up for what is right? Of course not, but you should pick your battles very carefully. While fighting is far more impulsively satisfying than submitting, you should restrain your impulses in favor of calm reflection. You might be in the wrong. You might be making a mountain out of a molehill. And even if right and proportion are on your side, the real world is not an action movie. You could easily fail and you have a lot to lose. August 5, 2014. When to be meek. If you're not getting what you want out of life, people usually advise you to speak up and demand what's coming to you. You'll never get anywhere just saying please and thank you. You've got to stand up and assert yourself. Strangely, though, most of the people who offer this advice arena Euro-T getting what they want out of life, either. If they Euro-They really got a foolproof strategy to get ahead, why don't a Euro-T they practice what they preach? The answer, naturally, is that demanding what's coming to you sounds a lot better in theory than it actually works. Standing up for yourself is a high-risk strategy. Yes, it occasionally pays off, but it's far from a sure thing. Sometimes you get nothing but aggravation. And sometimes the whole approach backfires. How? Being demanding causes other people to dislike you. And when people dislike you, they treat you worse. This doesn't mean that the meek will inherit the earth. But it does mean that meekness is underrated. Although you won't rise to the top of the heap by being meek, you probably won't get hurled to the bottom, either. Stand up for yourself isn't just overrated, it's also misdirected. We're quickest to dispense this advice to the people least likely to benefit from it. Consider. If you have wealth and power, standing up for yourself tends to work well. But we usually advise the wealthy and powerful to be gentle and generous. Perhaps we're just advising them to use their status ethically. But we often couch such advice in prudential terms. A smart CEO knows that a happy worker is a productive worker. If, on the other hand, you're poor and powerless, standing up for yourself is normally disastrous. If you have little to offer, you have to rely on the goodwill of others. And one of the surest ways to make a bonfire of your accumulated goodwill is to embrace a bad attitude. Charles Murray's Coming Apart doesn't directly discuss the value of meekness. But my analysis is very consistent with Murray's. My speculation. A major difference between the professional and working classes is that professionals appreciate the wages of meekness. They realize that if you want to move from high school to college, from college to an entry-level job, from an entry-level job to a promotion, you must get in the habit of saying, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" Even if you're elite in absolute terms, you ascend the hierarchy by showing deference to people who are even more elite than you are. The working class, in contrast, is dysfunctionally assertive. Maybe they put pride and machismo above success. Maybe they falsely believe that pride and machismo are a shortcut to success. In either case, as Murray emphasizes, one of the best ways for elites to help is to preach the meekness they've so often and so fruitfully practiced. Consider this one such sermon. February 20, 2012. Machismo versus appeasement. I suspect that the ultimate objection to pacifism and appeasement is that they are unmanly. A real man, brimming over with machismo, stands up for himself no matter what the consequences, never retreat, never surrender. The emotional appeal is undeniable. Who can forget this scene from The Return of the King? Gamling. Too few have come. We cannot defeat the armies of Mordor. Theoden. No, we cannot, but we will meet them in battle nonetheless. Intellectually, though, the glorification of machismo has no appeal at all. Who are the most macho of men? Criminals, thugs, conquerors. I've never heard anyone question the masculinity of Genghis Khan, but he was one of the worst men who ever lived. Manly values have their uses every now and then. Let us never forget the deeds of Claus von Stauffenberg, but only when the manly values of courage and determination are subordinate to the nerdy values of objectivity and justice. August 8, 2014. The cause of what I feel is what I do. How I eliminate pain. Over the last 20 years, I have experienced a litany of chronic pain: back pain, neck pain, foot pain, knee pain, forearm pain, and tailbone pain. I also experienced bizarre chronic tingling on my scalp. The good news is that I have managed to virtually eliminate every one of these problems. Perhaps these ills would have gone away on their own, but all my experience says the opposite. Without conscious action, each of these problems would have lingered, compounded, and probably intensified. Fortunately, I have developed a system that works wonders for me. Hopefully it will work for you too, if you ever share my plight. So how have I overcome my litany of pain problems? Let me start with what never works for me. 1. Doctors. I have talked to a wide variety of MDs about a wide variety of my problems. They have been beyond useless. Most offer nothing better than a name for my symptoms. Mr. Caplan, you have plantar fasciitis. Latin, how helpful. Some have given me prescription pills that are chemically equivalent to 2 non-prescription pills. Some have given me injections that numb the affected area, then leave me no better off than before. Often, they lecture me about unrelated issues just to fill the time. When people ask me if I've considered surgery, I am astounded by their naivete. If Robin Hansen hadn't made me a medical skeptic, my first-hand experience would have. 2. Exercise. Every time I've tried exercising a painful part of my body, I felt my problem getting worse. Lifting stuff made my forearm pain worse. Leaning over made my back pain worse. Running made my foot pain worse. The slogan says, no pain, no gain. For me, however, the right slogan is, pain begets pain. Enduring physical pain simply leads to even more pain in the future. Then what does work? 1. Obsessively examine behavior. Without exception, I've discovered that the cause of my pain is behavioral. In slogan form, the cause of what I feel is what I do. Sadly, the details of what causes what are far from obvious. Otherwise, all my pain would be extremely short-lived. The best fundamental pain remedy, therefore, is to obsessively search for any behavior that plausibly aggravates your pain. Then test your ideas by mindfully ceasing suspicious activity. For example, when I had horrible tailbone pain, I naturally suspected that I was sitting the wrong way. So I tried chairs with a wide variety of back angles until I discovered that a straight 90-degree angle was least painful for me. Similarly, when my right forearm started hurting a year ago, I eventually noticed that shaking hands horribly aggravated my pain. So I stopped shaking until the pain was a distant memory. 2. Orthotics. Doctors provide expensive verbiage. Your local pharmacy, in contrast, provides cheap salvation. After multiple doctors failed to alleviate my foot pain, I went to the pharmacy and bought every foot product they sold. Some turned out to be useless, but I quickly learned that a simple arch support provided marked pain reduction. This in turn led me to hunt for an even wider variety of arch supports. Ultimately, I wound up crazy gluing a women's arch support on top of a men's arch support, and my foot pain faded into nothingness. As far as I know, I am the world's leading assembler of artisanal foot orthotics. Another example. When I had tailbone pain, I naturally tried softer chairs. That helped slightly, but I soon resolved to buy and test a dozen different cushions. That, combined with a 90-degree chair, ultimately eliminated my tailbone pain. 3. Obsessively experiment. If you're out of good behavioral ideas, try any idea that crosses your mind. You can usually tell in a minute or two if you're aggravating your problem. When my back was in agony last September, I tried every sleeping posture, bed type, and pillow arrangement I could imagine. I expected almost every idea to fail but kept trying. Finally, I discovered that my back pain upon waking was minimal if I stacked 2 soft, thick pillows horizontally under my abdomen, then placed a flat pillow vertically under my upper chest. After hitting on this inverted T formation, I further experimented with a wide variety of pillows to enhance the pain-reducing effect. 4. Focus on proximate causes. Logically speaking, your pain-inducing behavioral problem could be a vitamin deficiency. In practice, however, reasoning from proximate causes is highly reliable, like causes like: the cause of foot pain is walking or standing the wrong way. The cause of tailbone pain is sitting the wrong way. The cause of forearm pain is grabbing and lifting the wrong way. My last episode of back pain was hard to diagnose, because I was initially in so much pain that all behaviors hurt. Once I made progress, however, I was able to discover that my back pain only amplified when I was sitting. This in turn led me to focus on different chairs, back cushions, and the like. Now I'm practically cured. While this is only one man's experience, my principles have repeatedly worked out of sample for me. When a new form of pain descends upon me, I open up my well-tested toolkit and get to work. Obviously, my approach will not work for everyone, but I suspect it will work wonders for 80% of people who mindfully apply it. And even if chronic pain has never troubled you, one day it will. So take heed. P.S. I got an MRI for my head tingling. As usual, the doctor found nothing and knew no way to help me. Fortunately, I eventually noticed that my head tingled much more whenever I was near a heat vent. So I drastically cut my use of artificial heat, dressed more warmly, and my tingling almost vanished. March 19, 2020. Omniscience is not enough. I've repeatedly debated with Tyler Cowen about the epistemic value of betting. Long before I amassed my 21-bet winning streak, I've argued that betting about substantive intellectual questions does all of the following. 1. Greatly improves the quality of our thinking by converting vague, ambiguous language into clear, specific claims. 2. Greatly improves the quality of discourse by incentivizing the rationally ignorant and rationally irrational to mute themselves. In the long run, it creates track records that greatly enhance even casual observers' ability to discover reliable thinkers and dismiss unreliable thinkers. Tyler's rebuttal has long been a variant on, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? If you really know more than other people, you shouldn't waste your time making bets. You should take your knowledge to financial markets and make a killing. Anyone who fails to do so isn't really epistemically exceptional, no matter how many bets they've won. For my part, I've always considered Tyler's reply quite weak. Rebuttal to his rebuttal. Many major intellectual issues simply aren't financially helpful to resolve. Suppose you could demonstrate that intelligent alien life exists in another galaxy. An amazing discovery, yet it's hard to see why financial markets would care in the slightest. This wouldn't be true, of course, if existence of intelligent alien life-proven securities existed, but they don't. Even the best developed financial markets focus on a tiny sliver of logical space. Exchanges fret far more about pork bellies than life extension. In any case, the world is so complex that you can perfectly understand a wide range of relevant issues but still go bankrupt investing on your knowledge. Suppose, for example, you knew exactly how much petroleum Earth contained. An amazing feat, but it's far from clear that you could make money off of this knowledge. At this point, you might reply, knowledge of a few facts won't ensure riches. Still, anyone who knew a lot of important facts could easily become a billionaire. Plausible, but is it true? I fear not. Consider this hypothetical. Back in March, you acquired omniscient foresight for all of the following variables: the GDP of every country on Earth, the unemployment rate of every country on Earth, total spending by country on consumption, investment, government purchases, transfers, exports, and imports in every country on Earth, and the true coronavirus infection and death rates. Suppose that, armed with this godlike knowledge, you tried to predict where international stock markets would stand today. What would you have predicted? Personally, I would have expected stock markets to fall by at least 2/3 RDS, and remain around that low level. I'm not alone, as this Twitter poll shows. In reality, global markets have almost fully recovered. With 2020 hindsight, maybe this will make sense, but I remain utterly confused. What I do know, however, is that omniscient foresight about a long list of macroeconomic variables wouldn't have made me rich. Indeed, I could easily have lost everything. Full of hubris in my godlike knowledge, I might have leveraged all my assets to short global markets. Only too late would I have found that omniscience is not enough. You can have flawless knowledge of the macroeconomy yet dangerously unreliable knowledge of the financial economy. One could protest. You could have made a killing if your omniscience extended to specific firms. Imagine if you perfectly foresaw how much people would start buying from Amazon. That sounds right, but reinforces my main point. Namely, the market poorly rewards deep, accurate knowledge of the big picture. If you want to get rich, you're better off knowing the right kinds of trivia. Not convinced? Ask yourself. If you wanted to get rich, which would you rather know? The release date for the first coronavirus vaccine? Not convinced. Ask yourself. If you wanted to get rich, which would you rather know? The release date for the first coronavirus vaccine or the name of the company that discovers this vaccine? If you care about the big picture, when is obviously vastly more important than who. If you're looking for a mountain of gold, however, who is vastly more important than when. Last question. Isn't it comically convenient for me to claim that I just so happen to have great knowledge of the big picture, but mediocre knowledge of how to become a billionaire? No, because the tournament to gain great knowledge of the big picture is much less competitive than the tournament to become a billionaire. The world is packed with brilliant people who desperately want to become fabulously rich. The quest to grasp the big picture, in contrast, is only a nerdy hobby. In a world where 10% of MIT and Caltech graduates devoted their lives and egos to public betting, my betting record would be lost in the shuffle. The reason I've excelled, in short, is that most of the thinkers able to outrun me neither know nor care that there's a race. August 24, 2020. Tranquility for $1 a day, an open letter to Adbusters. Dear Adbusters. While your publication seems to have little use for neoclassical economics professors, there is at least one topic where you have my sympathy. Like you, I find most advertising to be extremely painful. Commercial radio, with its shrill and mind-numbing sales pitches, is the worst. But the ads on TV are almost as bad. A couple of years ago, however, I managed to eliminate 98% of the advertising-related aggravation in my life, and I'd like to share how I did it. While the following may seem flippant, I mean it in all seriousness. I freed myself from the pain of advertising by 1. Subscribing to XM Radio. This product, available for $12.95 per month, allows me to enjoy a fantastic variety of music, completely commercial-free. Unlike public radio, moreover, there are no excruciating pledge drives. 2. Getting a digital video recorder, DVR, from Dish Network. As long as I plan ahead, I can conveniently pre-record any program I want to watch, then fast-forward through all commercials. It's not quite as good as not having commercials in the first place, but it's close. The cost? $4.98 per month. Admittedly, another downside of commercial television is that it tends to be bland and insipid, because bland and insipid gets ratings, which means advertising revenue. But the solution for this problem has been around for decades. 3. Subscribing to HBO. For $13.99 per month, you can watch high-quality programs with artistic integrity, like The Sopranos and Rome. Combined with a DVR, you get even more value, because you can pre-record everything worth watching. The total monthly cost of Tranquility, $31.92, or about $1 a day. If you can afford the $35 per year annual subscription fee to hear people complain about commercials and Adbusters, you can easily afford to pay $1 a day to actually solve your problem. My solution obviously does little to rid our whole culture of advertising. It is only an individual-level solution, but at minimum, my advice will significantly improve your life. Call it corporate blackmail if you must, but don't cut off your nose to spite your face. Furthermore, and now the economist in me re-emerges. Beyond the individual level, the problem of advertising shouldn't be solved. Hard as it is for me or you to fathom, many people don't mind or actually like commercials. When I visit my dad, he yells at me for muting them. As with religious disagreement, the best solution to commercial disagreement is live and let live. Sincerely, Professor Bryan Caplan, Department of Economics, George Mason University, November 14, 2005. Let them get roommates. A fun fact about the US versus Europe is that the poorest 25% of Americans have more living space than the average European. But some Americans have been left behind. Our most deprived citizens often sleep 3 to a room, eat prison-grade food, and share bathroom facilities with dozens of unhygienic strangers. They are known as college students. I know. I lived in a triple in the UC Berkeley dorms back in 90 to 91. I was the last guy to arrive, so naturally I got the top bunk. Not fun. But who feels sorry for college students in a triple? No one, as best I can tell. They barely even feel sorry for themselves. They're just supposed to get used to it, to suck it up, and they do. As long as they aren't contributing to society, they ought to concentrate on bettering themselves, not complain about the unfairness of it all. A friend of mine who is a bishop in the Mormon church tells me that before anyone can go on the church dole, they get a little advice from a Mormon financial planner. The planner takes a good look at the lifestyle of the needy and frequently concludes that frugal living, not financial assistance, is the right answer. As Econ Log's resident non-bleeding heart libertarian, this sensible Mormon practice suggests a hard-boiled question. Why aren't relatively poor Americans expected to live like college students? To put it more concretely, before anyone starts collecting welfare, it is more than fair to ask them for starters to try to solve their own problem by taking on some roommates. Is it beneath their dignity to live like college students? I think not. While I'm stepping on some sensitivities, I may as well point out a nice side benefit. If you choose your roommates wisely, you don't need the government to subsidize daycare just to get single moms back in the labor force. You've got a ready-made babysitting co-op right in your own home. He probably doesn't want the credit, but I'd still like to thank Paul Krugman for the inspiration. March 25, 2005. The economics of the gift of life. If someone gives another person $100, almost all economists agree that the recipient is better off. Hardline neoclassical economists will say it's true by definition. The rest won't be so emphatic, but they'll confidently agree. Even happiness researchers will probably sign on. Income doesn't raise happiness much, but the effects are still positive. If someone gives another person the gift of life, however, I've noticed that many economists suddenly become agnostic. $100? Definitely an improvement. Being alive? Meh. It's hard to see the logic. Why would a minor gift of cash be a clear-cut gain, but a massive gift of human capital be a question mark? In both cases, the recipient seems to have what economists call free disposal, a cheap, painless way of getting rid of the unwanted gift. Don't want $100? Drop it on the sidewalk. Don't want to be alive? Drop yourself on the sidewalk. As the great Epicurus wrote. Yet much worse still is the man who says it is good not to be born, but once born makes haste to pass the gates of death. For if he says this from conviction, why does he not pass away out of life? For it is open to him to do so, if he had firmly made up his mind to this. But if he speaks in jest, his words are idle among men who cannot receive them. You could object that suicide is a lot more painful than it looks. Yes, there are painless, effective ways to do away with yourself. But before you leap, you have to live with the knowledge that you're causing great pain to everyone who cares about you. If you'd never existed, you wouldn't be missed. Once you accept this line of thinking, though, $100 could easily be a curse, too. Many people couldn't throw away $100 without feeling like idiots. And once they have the money, their standards of acceptable consumption might ratchet up, so they actually need the gift to compensate. Ultimately, though, skepticism about the value of either gift $100 or life itself seems implausible and forced. While it's conceivable that the recipient will wish his benefactor had left him alone, it's highly unlikely. As I quip in Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, no one asks to be born, but almost everyone would if he could. The same holds for sneaking $100 bills in strangers' pockets. August 29, 2010. The Fallacy of Dulling the Pain of Poverty. Why are the poor more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol? As a matter of dollars and cents, substance abuse should rise, not fall, with income. These habits are expensive, both directly and indirectly. Directly, drugs and alcohol cost money. Indirectly, drug and alcohol abuse make you less employable, less healthy, more reckless, and more likely to get in trouble with the law. First-hand accounts of poverty generally recognize that heavy users of drugs and alcohol pay a high material cost. Yet they rarely reach my verdict that other factors like low IQ, low conscientiousness, low patience, or plain irrationality must be driving both poverty and substance abuse. Instead, observers usually say that the poor consume drugs and alcohol to dull the pain. Some even argue that the poor are being entirely rational. If your life is a living hell, narcotizing yourself is the simplest solution. There's just one problem with this explanation. By almost all accounts, substance abuse eventually makes your life worse. The long-term addict's life is utterly wretched even if you average in his periodic drug-induced euphorias. Someone who has yet to start using drugs and alcohol doesn't face a choice between full pain and dulled pain. Instead, he chooses between two paths of pain. Path number 1. Full pain in the short run, followed by gradual life progress. Path number 2. Dulled pain in the short run, followed by a gradual downward spiral into abject misery. Suppose you're poor. Your life is unusually painful, so the immediate effect of drugs and alcohol is especially attractive. The long-run prognosis for a poor substance abuser, however, is especially repellent. You hit rock bottom sooner because you don't have far to fall. And your version of rock bottom is extra bleak because you lack the financial resources and social connections to cushion the blow and get back on your feet. The lesson: on net, poverty isn't a believable root cause of substance abuse, because being poor doesn't make substance abuse a better overall deal. Why then would poor people be more inclined to narcotize themselves? Once again, we should look for root causes of poverty and pathology. Low patience is the most obvious suspect. If you loathe to defer gratification, you'll tend to have low income, and eagerly use drugs and alcohol today despite their awful cost down the line. Closing questions. If you were poor, would you turn to drugs and alcohol? If you were a social worker, would you advise the poor to turn to drugs and alcohol? I doubt it. The reason, of course, is that on some level you already know what I'm telling you. Poverty is no excuse for substance abuse because substance abuse is an absurd response to poverty. July 26, 2012. The depression preference. When I describe mental illness as an extreme, socially disapproved preference, the most convincing counterexample people offer is depression. Do I really think people want to be depressed or choose depression as a bizarre alternative lifestyle? My quick answer: these objections confuse preferences with meta-preferences. No one chooses to have the gene for cilantro aversion, yet people with the cilantro aversion gene are perfectly able to eat this vegetable. They just strongly prefer not to. Similarly, when I say that alcoholics are people who value heavy consumption of alcoholic beverages more than family harmony, this doesn't mean that they like having these priorities. If they could press a button that would eliminate their craving for alcohol, I bet many alcoholics would press it. But given their actual cravings, they prefer to keep drinking heavily despite the suffering of their families. The same holds even more strongly for the typical person diagnosed with clinical depression. Most people with loving families and successful careers are happy. Clinically depressed people, however, often have both loving families and successful careers, yet still want to kill themselves. Their preference is so extreme that it confuses the rest of us. They'd almost surely rather have a different preference. But it is their preference nonetheless. Not convinced? Think back to the early 1970s, when psychiatrists still classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. I object. Mental disorder? No, it's just an extreme, socially disapproved preference. When critics incredulously respond, do you really think people choose to be gay? I say they're confusing preferences with meta-preferences. To be gay is to sexually prefer people of your own gender. This doesn't mean that gays want to feel this way. If a gay-to-straight conversion button existed in the intolerant world of 1960, I bet that most gays would have gladly pushed it for themselves. Even today, I think many gay teens would press the conversion button to fit in and avoid conflict. But so what? Hypothetical buttons can't transform a preference into a disorder. Is this all just a word game? No. The economic distinction between preferences and constraints that I'm drawing upon has three big substantive implications here. First, people with extreme preferences could make different choices. People with cilantro aversion are able to eat cilantro. Alcoholics are able to stop drinking. The depressed can refrain from suicide. And so on. This is fundamentally different from my inability to bench press 300 pounds or live to be 150 years old. Second, as a corollary, people with extreme preferences can and routinely do respond to incentives. People with cilantro aversion are more likely to eat cilantro if other foods are expensive or inconvenient. Alcoholics respond to alcohol taxes and family pressure. Depressed parents may delay suicide until their kids are grown. Even in a tragic situation, incentives matter. Third, as a further corollary, people with extreme preferences can and routinely do find better ways to cope. People reshape their own preferences all the time. Perhaps you can do the same. Failing that, perhaps you can discover more constructive ways to satisfy the preferences that you're stuck with. For example, if you're extremely depressed despite great career success, you really should try some experiments in living. Perhaps you'll be miserable whatever you do. But if you've only experienced one narrow lifestyle, how do you know? Maybe you'd feel better if you tried putting friendship or hobbies above achievement. It's tempting to insist that there's something pathological about having conflicting preferences and meta-preferences. On reflection, however, these conflicts are a ubiquitous feature of human existence. Almost everyone would like to feel differently in some important dimension. Almost everyone reading this probably wishes they were less lazy, more patient, more outgoing, more loving, more ambitious, or more persistent. But you still are the preferences you really have. There's plenty of room for improvement, but that doesn't mean you're sick. I'm well aware that many physical symptoms also respond to incentives. You can pressure a diabetic to lose weight, which in turn reverses his diabetes. But all of these incentive effects require time to work. The symptoms of mental illness, in contrast, can and often do respond to incentives instantly, because they are choices that are always within your grasp. I'm divorcing you unless you stop drinking right now is a viable threat. I'm divorcing you unless you stop being diabetic right now is a silly one. March 26, 2019. How I raised my social intelligence. My social intelligence is a lot higher than it used to be. I still wouldn't say that I'm good with people. But in my youth, I was truly inept. In junior high, I had one real friend and many overt enemies. Since then, I've at least managed to claw my way up to mediocrity. A lot of social intelligence is in details and practice. If I could travel back in time and spend 5 minutes advising myself, though, here are the principles I would try to teach myself. 1. Good conversation is an exchange. The most basic form of social ineptitude is to say what's on your mind, even though you have no reason to believe your listeners are interested. Even more cloddish. saying what's on your mind, even though you know that your listeners are not interested. In a useful conversation, in contrast, there is a double coincidence of wants. You have to be interested in what I have to say. I have to be interested in what you have to say. This is an important reason why people with conventional interests seem more socially intelligent. Even if they don't check whether their audience cares, it probably does. I imagine that my teenage self would immediately object, but no one's interested in what I have to say. My two replies. 1. If that's true, it's still better to keep your thoughts to yourself than antagonize people you're going to see repeatedly. 2. People will be much more interested in your thoughts if you make marginal adjustments in topics and presentation. 2. Be friendly. It's not just good advice for libertarians, it's good advice for people. A strong presumption in favor of kindness and respect almost never hurts you, and often helps you. Note that I say presumption. Don't wait and see if people deserve friendly treatment. Hand it out first, no questions asked. You will make friends, very good. Avoid making enemies, good. And occasionally show undeserved kindness and respect, only mildly bad. 3. Keeping friends is more important than getting your way. You should think twice before asking anyone for help. If you still think it's a good idea, try to make your request easy to refuse. How would you feel about, is much better than, please just do me this one favor? In the short run, of course, the pushy approach is often effective. But life is a repeated game, pushing leads to resentment, and your relationships are more valuable than almost any specific victory. The world often perceives economists as low in social intelligence. Maybe we are, but there's no reason for it to be that way. The insight that good conversation is an exchange should come naturally to the economically literate. A policy of blanket friendliness ought to make sense to anyone familiar with weakly dominant strategies. And once you realize that asking for help is an implicit intertemporal trade, the wisdom of restraint and delicacy is easy to see. Admittedly, if your social intelligence has always been high, my recommendations will strike you as obvious. If they're so obvious, though, why do so many smart people act like they don't know them? June 17, 2009. Part 2, Life Hacks. My beautiful bubble. Unlike many readers of Coming Apart, you don't have to convince me that I live in a bubble. I've known it for decades. In fact, I think my 3 out of 20 score on the How Thick Is Your Bubble quiz greatly overstates my integration into American society. I live in a bubble within a bubble. You might even call it my imaginary charter city. I'm not just surrounded by Ph.D.s. I'm surrounded by libertarian economics Ph.D.s. I'm not just unfamiliar with NASCAR. I forget the very existence of professional sports for months at a time. I don't just watch shows for yuppies. I manage my entertainment to make sure that I never hear a commercial. In my world, Alex Tabarrok is more important than Barack Obama, Robin Hanson is more important than Paul Krugman, and the late Gary Gygax is more important than Jeremy Lin, whoever that might be. Unlike most American elites, I don't feel the least bit bad about living in a bubble. I share none of their egalitarian or nationalist scruples. Indeed, I've wanted to live in a bubble for as long as I can remember. Since childhood, I've struggled to psychologically and socially wall myself off from my society. At 40, I can fairly say, mission accomplished. Why put so much distance between myself and the outside world? Because despite my legendary optimism, I find my society unacceptable. It is dreary, insipid, ugly, boring, wrong, and wicked. Trying to reform it is largely futile. As the Smiths tell us, the world won't listen. Instead, I pursue the strategy that actually works, making my small corner of the world beautiful in my eyes. If you ever meet my children or see my office, you'll know what I mean. I'm hardly otter chic. I import almost everything I consume from the outside world. Indeed, I frequently leave the security of my bubble to walk the earth. But I do so as a tourist. Like a truffle pig, I hunt for the best that my society has to offer. I partake. Then I go back to my bubble and tell myself, America's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. Many people will find my attitude repugnant. They shouldn't. Yes, I step to the beat of my own drummer. But I'm not trying to push my lifestyle on others. I don't pester people who identify with America as it is. Indeed, I wish outsiders the best of luck. My only request If you're not happy with your world, don't try to pop my beautiful bubble. Either fix your world, or get to work and make a beautiful bubble of your own. March 9, 2012. Make your own bubble in 10 easy steps. Someone on Twitter asked for advice on how to create a beautiful bubble. Perhaps he was teasing me, but it's a good question. Here's my 10-step program. 1. Amicably divorce your society. Don't get angry at the strangers who surround you. Just accept the fact that you're not right for each other. 2. Stop paying attention to things that aggravate you unless A. They concretely affect your life and B. You can realistically do something about them. Start by ceasing to follow national and world news. 3. Pay less frequent attention to things that aggravate you even if they do concretely affect your life and you can realistically do something about them. For example, if you check your email 20 times a day and find the experience frustrating, try cutting back to 2 or 3 times a day. If you need to know about world politics, read history books, not newspaper articles. 4. Emotionally distance yourself from people you personally know who aggravate you. Don't purge anyone that causes more trouble than it saves. Just accept the fact that you aren't going to change them. 5. Abandon your first world problems mentality. Consciously compare your income to Haitian poverty, your health status to locked-in syndrome, your sorrow to that of a parent who has lost a child. As Tsunami Bomb tells us, be grateful that you have a brain for thinking and legs to take you places. For guidance, repeatedly read Epicurus' letter to Menicius and Julian Simon's works. Good mood. 6. Now that you have emptied your life of frustration, you are ready to fill it with joy. Start doing things that make you happy even nay, especially if most people in your ex-society disrespect them. Spend $1 a day to filter out annoying advertising and intrusion. 7. Actively try to make more friends with people who share your likes. In the internet age, this is shockingly easy. Don't try to make more friends who share your dislikes. You should build friendship on common passions, not joint contempt. 8. Find a career you really enjoy. Ask yourself, will I take daily pride in this work? And, are the kind of people I want to befriend statistically overrepresented in this line of work? If you had to signal for years to get this job, sigh, signal, and see step 5. If you're single, stop dating outside of your subculture. Happy relationships are based on shared values and mutual admiration so intense that outsiders laugh. Let them laugh. 10. Now that your own life is in order, you are emotionally ready to quixotically visit your ex-society. Maybe you want to publicly argue for open borders, abolition of the minimum wage, or pacifism. Go for it. Bend over backwards to be friendly. Take pride in your quixotic quest. Then go home to your beautiful bubble and relax. Coda. Many perpetually aggravated people tell me they just can't adopt my advice. Perhaps they're right to think that they can't follow my advice 100%. But so what? Anyone can adopt my advice at the margin. Why not spend 1 extra hour a day in your bubble and see what happens? April 11, 2013. Shy Male Nerds and the Bubble Strategy. Scott Alexander keeps writing intellectually powerful critiques of radical feminism's war on shy male nerds, SMNs. His latest. When feminists say that the market failure for young women is caused by slut-shaming, I stop slut-shaming, and so do most other decent people. When men say that the market failure for young men is caused by nerd-shaming, feminists write dozens of very popular articles called things like on nerd entitlement. The reason that my better nature thinks that it's irrelevant whether or not Penny's experience growing up was better or worse than Aronson's. When someone tells you that something you are doing is making their life miserable, you don't lecture them about how your life is worse, even if it's true. You stop doing IT. Quick aside. In high school, I definitely fit the SMN profile. I played Dungeons and Dragons with my male friends every Saturday night, and did not go to prom. By my second year of college, however, the problem ceased to be personally relevant. I met my wife when I was 19, married at 23, and we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. My experience may color my advice, but I leave readers to decide if that's a bug or a feature. My main question when reading Scott's defense of SMNs: is this really the best way to help them out? Sure, some SMNs may feel better after reading Scott. But Scott's main intended audience seems to be the feminists who mistreat SMNs. And frankly, I can't imagine even Scott's earnest voice changing their minds. In fact, even Scott seems extremely pessimistic. He even ends his conclusion with a disclaimer. I already know that there are people reading this planning to write responses with titles like entitled "Blogger says all women exist for his personal sexual pleasure. Also men are more oppressed than. Women, also nerds, are more oppressed than World War II-era Jews." If helping SMNs is the goal, I think I know a better way. As usual, I recommend self-help. Specifically, SMNs should exclude hostile feminists from their bubble. Stop arguing with hostile feminists. Stop reading them. If you know any in real life, stop associating with them. Even if they have halfway decent reasons for berating you, you're clearly not right for each other. The best response is to amicably go your separate ways. I realize that this approach does not solve the deeper problem of SMN loneliness. But that's no reason to amplify your unhappiness with unpleasant, fruitless social interaction with people who emotionally abuse you. January 2, 2015. 2 heuristics to live by when you don't know what you're doing. When we see people making bad decisions, whether as consumers or voters, we often blame the complexity of the issues they face. If Ph.D. economists can't figure out the best mortgage to use, how can we expect the average borrower to do so? If health policy experts can't agree on how to fix the U.S. medical system, what is the typical voter to think? But if complexity is your only demon, I've got 2 simple rules of thumb to exorcise him. Here goes. If you don't have clear and convincing evidence that doing something is better than doing nothing, do nothing. 2. If you know that doing nothing is bad, but don't have clear and convincing evidence that one action is better than another, do the simplest, standard thing. I frequently apply these rules to my consumption decisions. Until I'm convinced that a product will make my life better, I just don't buy it. I might enjoy a big plasma TV, but until a seller clearly explains how he's going to painlessly install it in my house, I'm not buying one. If I do decide in favor of a plasma TV, but remain confused about which one to buy, I'll probably just get the biggest one that Costco carries. In the mortgage market, similarly, my heuristics say, A. Rent until it's clear that buying will improve your life, and B. Get a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage from an established lender. Don't buy a house you might not be able to afford by signing a contract you can't explain to your friends. Needless to say, voters could also use these heuristics to decide which policies to support. Until there's clear and convincing evidence that healthcare reform or invading someone will make things better, you're better off saying no. And if you are convinced that doing something is better than doing nothing, your best bet is to go with the simplest, standard option. Admittedly, that last sentence of advice makes me a little uncomfortable. Many policies I detest, like immigration restrictions, are nevertheless simple and standard. But overall, I'm not too worried about the political consequences of my rules of thumb. If voters just learned to say no until a politician could clearly show that government action would improve the world, voters would shout down most of the policies I detest before they ever got to my second heuristic. July 14, 2008. More bang for your buck, or better ways to buy your happiness. Money has little effect on happiness. Ancient Greeks like Epicurus said it, and modern empirical psychology confirms it. Why do we have so much trouble accepting this? In part, because our immediate reaction to money is highly favorable and that sticks in our minds. Before long, however, hedonic adaptation kicks in. We start to take our good fortune for granted and then we largely forget that our fortune is good. But there's probably another important reason why we have so much trouble accepting the weak effect of money on happiness. Namely, there are so many ways to buy happiness with money. The fact that money doesn't buy happiness clashes with the equally obvious fact that money can buy happiness. The simplest reconciliation, of course, is that most people spend their money poorly. And in my experience, this reconciliation is entirely correct. Most people stubbornly spend lots of money on hedonic dead ends, while ignoring omnipresent opportunities to turn cash into smiles. So what are these alleged omnipresent opportunities? Here are my top picks. 1. Buy your way out of unpleasant chores by hiring other people to do them for you. Start with cleaning, laundry, yard work, auto repair, childcare, and tax preparation. 2. Buy your way out of unpleasant chores by buying different products. Most obviously, switch to disposable plates, cups, and utensils. It's very cheap and saves lots of time. If this gives you environmental guilt, compensate with some effective altruism. 3. The leading source of happiness is pleasant social interaction. Use money to get more of it and make your interaction more pleasant. If you have to spend hours preparing for and cleaning up after any gathering, you probably won't enjoy it much. So cut down on both preparation and cleanup using number 1 and number 2. 4. Don't buy products to impress strangers or casual acquaintances. They're barely paying any attention to you anyway. Indeed, even your close friends probably don't pay that much attention to the details of your possessions. So if you and your immediate family won't durably enjoy an expensive product, such as granite countertops, save your money. 5. Entertainment spending is one of the best ways to convert money into happiness. That's why they call it entertainment. 6. If you live with other people, soundproof your house, especially if you have kids. Other people's music, TV, and phone conversations, not to mention children's crying, don't just get on your nerves, they create needless conflict. But you don't have to choose between isolation and serenity. Solid wood doors aren't exactly cheap, but they're affordable. 7. Put less effort into finding a job that pays better than your current job. Put more effort into finding a job that is more enjoyable than your current job. First and foremost, look for jobs with lots of pleasant social interaction. Overarching doubt. Won't these attitudes alienate more conventional people? My answer: only mildly, as long as you're friendly. So be friendly. And don't forget that these attitudes also attract people who are eager to actually enjoy life. Finally, you can and should use your money to build and maintain your beautiful bubble. Keller Scholl rightly points out that I should have mentioned, spend money to cut your commuting time. April 15, 2019. What a bet shows. Whenever I win a bet, critics rush to say, this doesn't prove you know better than me. They're right. Bets prove nothing. But that's a silly standard. For empirical questions, definitive proof is unavailable, so we have to settle for degrees of probability. By this reasonable measure, how probative are bets? Taken individually, most bets are only marginally so. Even if one side offers 1,000 to 1 odds and loses, this might only show that the loser was a fool to offer such great odds, not that his position on the underlying issue is flat wrong. When we move from solitary bets to betting records, however, bets are telling indeed. A guy who wins one bet could easily have gotten lucky. But someone who wins 10 out of 10 bets or, in my case, 14 out of 14 bets almost certainly has superior knowledge and judgment. This is especially true if someone lives the bettor's oath by credibly promising to bet on, or retract, any public statement. A bet is a lot like a tennis match. One victory slightly raises the probability that the winner is the superior player, but it's entirely possible that he just got lucky. A betting record, in contrast, is a lot like a tennis ranking. People who win consistently against any challenger do so by skill, not luck. After losing our unemployment bet, Tyler Cowen objected that betting produces a celebratory mindset in the victor. That lowers the quality of dialogue and also introspection, just as political campaigns lower the quality of various ideas, too much emphasis on the candidates and the competition. Tyler's gets very close to the truth but misses the most important lesson. Namely, in a busy world, ranking people by accuracy is not only helpful in the search for truth, but vital. No one has time to listen to more than a fraction of the armies of talking heads, or the memory to recall more than a fraction of their arguments. If we want to know the future as well as we're able, we need to identify people with good judgment and ignore people with bad judgment. The first step, of course, is to unfollow pundits who refuse to put their money where their mouths are. We should take them as seriously as self-proclaimed tennis champions who've never publicly played a match. June 14, 2017. A Bettors Tale. Here's a great yarn of betting and political irrationality courtesy of Econ log reader Mathieu Giroux, used with his permission. My uncle, like the vast majority of people living in North America, is not a fan of the idea of open borders. In fact, he's vehemently opposed. The first time I told him I favored the idea, his reaction was, well, a very hard-to-forget combination of incredulity and indignation. Free trade in goods was fine, he maintained, but to extend the idea to labor madness. We would debate the issue via email and when we saw each other in person. During one such visit, he was telling me, as he had repeatedly, that support for open borders was just one hell of an out-there idea. I normally responded by saying that an idea being outside the mainstream hardly meant it was a bad idea. After all, support for many things that are now sacrosanct in our culture once only enjoyed the support of a few articulate radicals. However, at that moment, a different response came to mind. I knew that the Wall Street Journal had editorialized in favor of open borders under Robert Bartley. My uncle, a fiscal conservative who works in the financial sector, surely could not deny that the Wall Street Journal was an impeccably mainstream publication. So I said, is the Wall Street Journal crazy? It has editorialized in favor of open borders. He did not believe that the journal would ever be so out there. Knowing I was right, and inspired by Bryan, I suggested we bet to settle the dispute. The terms were clear. $50 would be owed to me if I could find an editorial by the journal calling for open borders and $50 owed to him if I couldn't. A 30-second Google search later and there it was. An editorial by the Wall Street Journal endorsing my ultra-marginal, insane libertarian notion of open borders. The editorial even used the term open borders. My uncle was not happy. This is from the 80s, he protested. Did I say it was written yesterday? Come on, Bob, the terms of the bet were clear. Any editorial from the journal advocating this and you owe me $50. I really didn't feel this was sneaky since it's not like the journal has ever repudiated or even distanced itself from this position and has indeed written many editorials advocating policies consistent with the goal of ultimately opening up the borders completely. A few minutes later, I was $50 richer and he was $50 poorer. Since then, I have routinely suggested betting to settle disputes. No one else has agreed to bet, which shows you that even belligerent partisans back off when there is a cost to being wrong. Oh, and in all fairness to my uncle, he's a very bright, pleasant, and successful guy. I hope to be like him in many ways, but, you know, without being terribly wrong on hugely important moral issues. I'd add that Matthew's uncle is praiseworthy for betting in the first place. As I've pledged before, when I win a bet, I will not shame my opponent, for a betting loser has far more honor than the mass of men who live by loose in. Idle Talk. March 27, 2015. Exposure Therapy. When Probabilities Fail. In Chapter 4 of Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, I show that objectively speaking, kids today are safer than ever. And I'm far from the first social scientist to point out the public's systematically biased beliefs about risk. Aaron Wildavsky, Kip Viscusi, Cass Sunstein, or Levitt and Dubner. One fact that we quants tend to overlook, unfortunately, is that many people still feel extremely afraid even after they accept the facts. This doesn't mean that correcting misconceptions is useless. Many people's fear does respond to facts. But it does leave a tough question. What can we do for everyone else? I'm pleased to report that an effective supplement to objective risk analysis exists. It's called exposure therapy. Psychologists use it to help people with severe anxiety problems, people who have nothing to fear but fear itself. The best source I've found is the Handbook of Exposure Therapies. Intuitively, the idea is to get people to face their fears. From the introductory chapter, exposure therapy involves deliberate and planned exposure to a feared stimulus, or representation of the stimulus, until the intensity of the person's distress recedes. The basic steps. 1. Choose to vividly experience a disturbing but tolerable fear. Depending on the fear, this means either first-hand experience, e.g. spiders, or detailed imagination, e.g. the kidnapping of your child. Regardless of the way exposure therapy is conducted, clients are encouraged to confront their fears in the present tense. For example, a client recounting a traumatic event in exposure therapy is encouraged to describe the event as if it were being relived. 2. Continue doing number 1 until the experience or imagination has become less frightening. 3. Move on to more intense anxieties and repeat. The handbook also reviews clinical evidence on exposure therapy versus other talk therapies versus drugs versus nothing versus combinations of the above. The contributors to this volume are obviously sympathetic to exposure therapy, but their survey of the evidence is still impressive. In almost every case, they conclude that exposure therapy plus X is no better than and often worse than exposure therapy alone. The zero or negative marginal benefit of drugs is awfully Hansonian. With respect to short-run efficacy, a number of studies suggest that some drugs may enhance the effects of exposure-based CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. However, an approximately equal number of clinical trials provide no support for this conclusion, and a meta-analysis of this literature indicates that combined treatment is no more effective than CBT alone. On the other hand, clinical trials have consistently failed to support an advantage of combined treatment when long-term outcomes are considered. In fact, the two largest and most well-designed trials of combined treatments provide unambiguous evidence that pharmacotherapy interferes with the durability of exposure-based CBT. Does this mean that teaching probabilities is a waste of time? Not at all. Many people's anxiety does respond to objective information. But even if your anxiety is more stubborn, it's still good to learn about probabilities. If the sky really is falling, you should run for cover. But if the sky isn't falling, the best way to feel better is to sit down under the open sky and face your fear. P.S. How can a Shazian take this stuff seriously? Easily. Shash would deny that anxiety disorders are a disease. But he'd surely admit that extreme fear of minor risks is a problem in living, and there's nothing anti-Shazian about carefully comparing different strategies for overcoming such problems. November 11, 2009. Is the Econ Ph.D. a free lunch? While you're earning a Ph.D. in economics, you learn two big lessons. There's no such thing as a free lunch. 2. You are in serious pain. On reflection, though, I've decided that both of these lessons fall short of the truth. In fact, a Ph.D. in economics is, relative to other graduate degrees, an amazing deal. It's not literally a free lunch, but it is a heavily discounted lunch. Consider. 1. What other Ph.D. can you realistically finish in 4 years? People in other fields routinely take 6 or 8 years to get their degrees. Most economists don't finish in 4 years, but it's quite doable. 2. What other Ph.D. can you earn without previous familiarity with the field? Ph.D. level Econ is so different from undergraduate Econ that it isn't that much of a handicap to start from scratch. You do of course need to know a fair amount of math, but you could have learned that math studying dozens of other fields. 3. What other profession gives you so much freedom to choose your research topics? Many economists now devote their careers to studying topics which an outsider would classify as political science, psychology, or sociology. Some economists even do work that basically amounts to history or philosophy, though they probably need to work on more conventional topics until they get tenure. 4. What other Ph.D. has such a great safety net? A Ph.D. in philosophy, not redundant, though it seems so, who fails to become a professor of philosophy has few good alternatives. An Econ Ph.D. who fails to become an Econ professor can become an economic consultant and make big money. 5. The pain of the Econ Ph.D. is not all that bad. Yes, it hurts at the time. But the key question too many grad students in Econ, including me, lose sight of is, compared to what? Does it hurt more to be an Econ Ph.D. than a Ph.D. in math? History? Classics? Does it hurt compared to a real job? I think not. Overall, the Econ Ph.D. is such a good deal that I would seriously advise people who want to do research in political science, psychology, or even history to just get an Econ Ph.D. and become a professor of economics. Even if you have to research topics you don't care about until you get tenure, and you probably won't have to, you could easily earn tenure in Econ before you would have defended your dissertation in another field. Needless to say, it's not really in my interest for my field to be flooded by the best students in political science, psychology, history, and beyond. But besides giving me the opportunity to do the work I love, with reasonable material comfort, and zero job stress, what's my field ever done for me? October 15, 2005. Being single is a luxury. I'm baffled by people who blame declining marriage rates on poverty. Why? Because being single is more expensive than being married. Picture two singles living separately. If they marry, they sharply cut their total housing costs. They cut the total cost of furniture, appliances, fuel, and health insurance. Even groceries get cheaper. Think Costco. These savings are especially blatant when your income is low. Even the official poverty line acknowledges them. The poverty threshold for a household with one adult is $11,139. The poverty threshold for a household with two adults is $14,218. When two individuals at the poverty line maintain separate households, they're effectively spending 2 times $11,139 minus $14,218 equals $8,060 a year to stay single. But wait, there's more. Marriage doesn't just cut expenses. It raises couples' income. In the NLSY, married men earn about 40% more than comparable single men. Married women earn about 10% less than comparable single women. From a couple's point of view, that's a big net bonus. And much of this bonus seems to be causal. If you're rich, admittedly, you have to consider the marriage tax. But weighed against all the financial benefits of marriage, it's usually only a modest drawback. Yes, you can capture some of these benefits simply by cohabitating. But hardly all, and cohabitation is far less stable than marriage. Long-term joint investments like buying a house are a lot more likely to blow up in your face. And while there may be some male cohabitation premium, it's smaller than the marriage premium. If being single is so expensive, why are the poor far less likely to get married and stay married? I'm sure you could come up with a stilted neoclassical explanation, but this is yet another case where behavioral economics and personality psychology have a better story. Namely, some people are extremely impulsive and short-sighted. If you're one of them, you tend to mess up your life in every way. You don't invest in your career, and you don't invest in your relationships. You take advantage of your boss and coworkers, and you take advantage of your romantic partners. You refuse to swallow your pride to admit that the best job and the best spouse you can get, though far from ideal, are much better than nothing. Your behavior feels good at the time, but in the long run, people see you for what you are, and you end up poor and alone. February 8, 2012. What's really wrong with cryonics? I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying. Woody Allen. One of the most engaging after-lunch conversations of my life was when Robin Hanson sat me down and gave me the cryonics version of the Drake equation. The Drake equation multiplies 7 variables together in order to calculate the number of civilizations in our galaxy with which communication is possible. The Hanson equation, similarly, multiplies a bunch of factors together in order to calculate how many expected years of life you will gain by signing a contract to freeze your head when you die. During his presentation, I noticed that Robin spent almost all of his time on various scientific sub-disciplines and the trajectory of their progress. On these matters, I was fairly willing to defer to his superior knowledge, with the caveat that perhaps his enthusiasm was carrying him away. What disturbed me was when I realized how low he set his threshold for success. Robin didn't care about biological survival. He didn't need his brain implanted in a cloned body. He just wanted his neurons preserved well enough to upload himself into a computer. To my mind, it was ridiculously easy to prove that uploading yourself isn't life extension. An upload is merely a simulation. It wouldn't be you, I remarked. It would if the simulation were accurate enough, he told me. I thought I had him trapped. Suppose we uploaded you while you were still alive. Are you saying that if someone blew your biological head off with a shotgun, you'd still be alive? Robin didn't even blink. I'd say that I just got smaller. The more I furrowed my brow, the more earnestly he spoke. It all depends on what you choose to define as you, he finally declared. I said, but that's a circular definition. Illogical. He didn't much care. Then I attacked him from a different angle. If I'm whatever I define as me, why bother with cryonics? Why not define myself as my Y chromosome or my writings or the human race or carbon? By Robin's standard, All it takes to vastly extend your life is to identify yourself with something highly durable. His reply: there are limits to what you can choose to identify with. I was dumbstruck at the time. But now I'd like to ask him, okay, then why don't you spend more time trying to overcome your limited ability to identify with durable things? Maybe psychiatric drugs or brain surgery would do the trick. I'd like to think that Robin's an outlier among cryonics advocates, but in my experience, he's perfectly typical. Fascination with technology crowds out not just philosophy of mind, but common sense. My latest cryonics encounter was especially memorable. When I repeated my standard objections, the advocate flatly replied, "Those aren't interesting questions." Not interesting questions? They're common sense, and they go to the heart of the cryonic dream. Personally, I'd really like to live forever, in the normal English sense of the phrase, live forever. I wish cryonics could realistically offer me that. Unfortunately, the sophistry of its advocates leaves me pessimistic. If they had a ghost of a chance of giving me what I want, they wouldn't need to twist the English language. November 29, 2009. Why pack for the same trip twice? Travelers often repeatedly visit the same family members, the same friends. Each visit normally requires 2 packing sessions. You pack the stuff you'll need, then repack the stuff you brought. Each leg takes time and energy, and possibly, depending on the airline, $25 to $50 per bag in out-of-pocket cost. Worse still, each packing session entails a risk of aggravating memory lapse. One time, you forget a belt, another, your toothpaste. Grr. There is a better way. Unless your family or friends live in very confined quarters, politely ask to permanently store 1 trip's worth of supplies at each destination. If your hosts appreciate you, they'll probably say yes. From then on, you can visit them without traditional packing. The out-of-pocket cost is modest. And in any case, if you have the means to travel in the first world, out-of-pocket costs should be secondary to your time, effort, and aggravation costs. Truth be told, you probably have several suitcases worth of clothes you rarely wear. Why not pack them up and store them in several destinations you frequent? One fixed cost can save you years of marginal costs. Sure, if everyone did this, it might cease to be good advice. You probably don't want to store 20 suitcases for your 20 closest friends. And your closest friends probably feel the same way. But so what? Hardly anyone follows my strategy now, and that's unlikely to change. And even if my idea caught on, triage is the obvious response. Store your stuff at the 5 places you visit most often, and reciprocate for your 5 most frequent guests. Right now, I store a lot of stuff at my parents' house, and several useful items at Fabio Rojas' place. But I plan to take this a lot further. Next time I visit my parents, I'm leaving a week's stuff behind. I'll encourage them to do the same at my house. And when my kids have places of their own, I hope each will provide a few cubic feet for Grandpa Bryan. Question. Why do so few people use my strategy? The awkwardness of asking? Hostility of the host's spouse? Or just plain old-fashioned status quo bias? February 23, 2015. 10 things I learned in my first 10 years of parenting. My eldest son just turned 10, which means I've been a father for 10 years. Ergo, it's time to inventory the top things I've learned from my decade of experience. In no particular order. 1. Kids are a consumption good, and always have been. Have kids create beloved companions, pay forward the gift of life, and see the world anew, not to get a person to mold or boss around. 3. Discover things you and your kids enjoy doing together, and make plenty of time to actually do them. 4. You have little effect on your child's intelligence, success, or even character. But you have a genuine effect on his appreciation of you and how he feels about and remembers you. 5. Your kids' preferences may differ from your childhood preferences, but it's still helpful to remember and try to be the kind of parent you wish you'd had. 6. Don't use discipline to turn your kid into a good person when he's an adult. It won't work. Use discipline to turn your kid into a good roommate when he's a kid. It won't work miracles, but it's way better than nothing. 7. Mild discipline, mechanically enforced, deters bad behavior far more effectively than harsh discipline, arbitrarily enforced. Idle threats, no matter how lurid, I'll sell you to the gypsies if you don't eat your dinner. I'll turn this car around to Disneyland right now. Do not improve behavior at all. 8. Never lie to your children. Kids soon see through your deception, reputation matters, and in any case, lying is wrong. 9. Expressing anger at your children is counterproductive. It undermines your authority and gives wayward children hope of besting you. 10. Raise your children with kindness and respect. When they behave badly, calmly carry out promised punishments like Javert, then restart the game like Valjean. Bonus lesson. If your kids say you're embarrassing them, they're probably right. Don't argue, don't tease, just stop. December 10, 2012. 10 more things I learned in my first 10 years of parenting. After I finished my last post, parenting life lessons kept coming to mind. 10 more. 1. You cannot be a bad spouse and a good parent. Do not let your kids ignore you. If your words call for a response, immediately make your question more and more blatant until you receive a response. 3. Do not give your kids a good reason to ignore you by being a repetitive windbag. 4. Do not change your parenting decisions in response to your kids complaining, repeated requests, or other rent-seeking. Caplan family motto. Complaining gets you nowhere in this family. 5. If you lack the willpower to resist your kids' rent-seeking on an issue, magnanimously give them what they would have extracted from you under duress. You won't get your way, but at least you won't blatantly reinforce their bad behavior. 6. At minimum, behavioral economics accurately describes children's behavior. Myopia, the endowment effect, availability bias, the works. 7. Other parents are pathological hazers. Ignore them. The average parent is probably less happy than the average non-parent, but being average is a choice. To have kids, or not to have kids, are the fundamental lifestyle options. Once you have your first child, the marginal cost of another child is small. By the age of 2, a pair of twins is often easier than a singleton. 9. TV is your friend, and if you think TV rots the brain, you aren't searching hard enough for good shows. The Simpsons is at least as good as Shakespeare. 10. Reduce the ambition of your family vacations until you have zero desire to scream at your kids or your spouse. The memory of one bad parental fight can easily override a child's memory of an otherwise magical week. Bonus lesson. I'm your parent, not your friend should mean I'll treat you better than any friend ever will, not I'll treat you worse than any friend will ever dare. To close on a sad note, show zero tolerance for irresponsible driving, and don't worry about being fair when you confiscate car keys. Driving is the most dangerous activity young people in our society engage in. The accident rate is highly responsive to choice, and the real world often refuses to give a high-risk driver a second chance. December 11, 2012. An Economist's Guide to Happier Parenting. Happiness research hits a lot of nerves, but the finding that kids don't make people happier may be the unkindest cut of all. As a proponent of having more kids, I could make methodological objections, but the truth is, I do notice a lot of people who don't seem to enjoy being parents. My view, however, is that to a fair degree, these parents just aren't doing it right. Fortunately, basic economics is here to lend a helping hand. My main observation about parental unhappiness is this. The last 10% of parenting hours causes half of all the parental unhappiness. First 2 hours with your kids, a joy. Second 2 hours, pretty good. Hours 5 to 8, tolerable. Hours 9 and 10, pain. Remaining hours, anguish. There are few better illustrations of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Once you see this clearly, there are some obvious solutions. 1. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Don't plan 3 activities every Saturday, and wind up exploding at your kids' behavior in the middle of the third. It's far better for them and you to do one thing together that you can all enjoy, than let them watch TV. Seriously. 2. If you can afford a nanny, get a nanny. If you can't afford a nanny yet, consider waiting to have kids until you can. If you're the typical person who isn't sure if he or she wants kids, you're well educated and have good income potential. So if you can't afford a nanny yet, you'll be able to soon enough. 3. Don't let American prejudice against live-in nannies influence you. Live-in nannies mean you can sleep in, stay out, and get a break when you need one. Your best bet is to get a mature woman to bond with your kids when they're infants, and keep her happy. A little respect goes a long way. 4. Read Judith Harris, The Nurture Assumption. Don't worry about molding your child for life. You couldn't do it if you tried. Realize, instead, that the purpose of discipline is A. To keep your kid in one piece. B. To make your life easier you can too. C. To force your kid to sacrifice very short-run gains, playing 10 more minutes, for short-run gains, not being cranky later today. Thus, I am adamant about naps. Partly this is because little kids get cranky without their naps, but I refuse to accept the fact. But mostly it's because I'll be cranky if I don't get a nap, and I can't nap if they don't. If you can't mold your child, what's the point? As Harris observes, that's a lot like asking if you can't mold your wife, what's the point? The point is to enjoy your time together. If you spend most of your time trying to make your kid be something he's not, no wonder you're not enjoying yourself and don't expect your kid to be grateful for your efforts. How would you like it if someone you depended on kept trying to change you? It's even more foolish to try to change a kid because he's likely to change in the desired direction all on his own in time. In the end, your kid will probably be a lot like you. June 25, 2006. Part 3, Professor Homeschool. How I love education. When I write about education, I suspect I come off as a Philistine. You might even boil my position down to, students are bored, and aren't acquiring job skills, so their education is a waste of time and money. But what about learning for its own sake? Why do I seem so closed to the possibility that education is a merit good that human beings ought to consume to uplift their souls? This question is awkward for me because, unlike many economists and libertarians, I actually believe in merit goods. For example, I believe that opera, especially 19th-century German opera, is the objective pinnacle of musical achievement. Given my stance, it's also natural to see great intrinsic value in the study of philosophy, history, literature, and the like. Truth be told, impractical education is central to my whole sense of identity. How can I live with myself when I ridicule the magic of education? My answer: I love education too much to respect the mediocre substitutes that schools actually offer. How do these substitutes fall short of my ideals? 1. Education, like opera, is only a merit good when it's done right. Real-world opera, happily, usually is done right. Real-world education, in contrast, is a travesty. Most educators are boring. They fail to bring the liveliest of subjects to life. They focus on irrelevant details and hollow technique. And in the social sciences and humanities, many of the great ideas and great thinkers aren't just wrong, but stupidly wrong. Take Marxism. As far as I'm concerned, it's no more a merit good than creation science. Grasping the thoughts of economically illiterate 19th-century hate-mongers is not a crucial ingredient of a life well lived. 2. Education, like opera, is only a merit good when experienced by minds capable of seriously appreciating it. Exposing bright, artistic minds to opera is great. Pushing opera on apathetic NASCAR fans is a waste of time and can easily ruin the experience for genuine opera aficionados. The same goes for philosophy, history, literature, and the like. Exposing bright, logical minds to philosophy is great. Pushing philosophy on apathetic undergraduates is a waste of time at best. Sure, there's some uncertainty about who's really open to great ideas. But there's far less uncertainty than educators like to tell themselves. Convincing a random student that epistemology is fascinating is virtually impossible. In the typical UC Berkeley class for philosophy majors, I rarely found more than 2 or 3 students who cared enough about the subject to study it on their own initiative. Can't education be improved? Yes, but major reform is unlikely. As long as professors make money while ruining great subjects, and the labor market rewards students for feigning interest, the charade will go on. My standards may seem unreasonably high, but they're typically realized in, for example, the Institute for Humane Studies summer seminars. A few professors who love teaching and have something they're burning to say deliver 2 or 3 lectures apiece. A few dozen self-selected students from around the world show up and happily participate. The students receive no academic credit, just a week of learning, sharing, and debating mind-blowing ideas. I love these summer seminars. They're beautiful, they're a merit good, and they bear almost no resemblance to the official coursework students had to endure to get a diploma. July 18, 2012. Good students rule. Most professors like good students, but I idolize them. For most professors, good students are a joy in the classroom, but a chore outside of the classroom. For me, good students are a joy through and through. I like talking with them, lunching with them, and even gaming with them. Good students have 4 key traits. First, good students genuinely want to learn. They don't study material merely because they see it on the syllabus or expect it on the test. Second, good students fight the natural human tendency to forget material right after the final exam. Unlike most students, they consciously choose to try to remember what they learn. Third, good students strive for what educational psychologists call transfer of learning. They earnestly try to apply what they've learned outside the classroom. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, good students put truth first. They aren't afraid to entertain and embrace socially unacceptable ideas. How can one become a good student? While decent IQ is important, being a good student is, to a large extent, a choice. Admit that there are important intellectual questions. Resist your impulsive answers. Don't worry about what people in your society are supposed to think. Calmly listen to the arguments of people who have reflected on the important intellectual questions longer than you have. Cross-examine the arguments. Apply your lessons to concrete cases. Do all this, and you're well on your way to being a good student. What's so great about good students? Selfishly speaking, they're fun to be around. I've spent decades searching for answers. It's great to share what I've found with eager minds in search of shortcuts. Entertainment value aside, though, good students make the world a better place. Imagine political debates or public policy if every voter were a good student. If I admire good students so much, how can I make the case against education? Because, as I've explained before, good students deserve something radically different from the status quo. People who care about learning should be surrounded by other students who feel the same way. In actual education systems, however, most students just grub credentials to signal for the labor market. Bad students sharply outnumber good students even in grad school. Most teachers react as you'd expect, by catering to the vast majority of anti-intellectual careerists in their classrooms. Better teachers try to raise the bar, but giving good students a passable experience is an uphill battle when 90% of the class doesn't even want to be there. Still, as always, we should focus on the positive. Today is the first day of a new academic year. I'll soon meet my latest wave of good students. They're going to be awesome. All the problems with the status quo notwithstanding, another great pedagogical journey is about to begin. August 26, 2013. Separating twins as economic illiteracy. Schools usually try to put twins in different classes. In part, it's for the convenience of the teacher. Identical twins can be hard to tell apart. But the main rationale is that if you separate twins, they will make more new friends. Isn't that great? If you've had a week of intro economics, I hope your answer is no. Consider, what would you do if aliens abducted all of your friends? In all likelihood, you'd wind up making a bunch of new friends, right? But it would be absurd to claim that the aliens had done you a favor. Before the body snatchers came along, you didn't need those new friends, because you were happy with the ones you already had. To argue otherwise is just make work bias. The same logic applies to splitting up twins. Sure, if you separate twins, they'll make more friends. But that hardly means you're doing them a favor. The reason why twins put less effort into making new friends is that they've already got a better friend than most of us will ever have. For twins, the marginal benefit of trying to make new friends is unusually small and cliquishness is their optimal response. You could argue, admittedly, that kids underestimate the benefit of making new friends. But what reason is there to believe that this is true? And in any case, that's no reason to specifically target twins. If you really believed that kids had an anti-new friends bias, you'd ask all parents to name their kids' best friends, and make an effort to separate as many children as possible from the kids they like the most. You'll thank me later, right? A decade or two ago, pundits often said that the Japanese economy was doing well because all their factories were destroyed during World War II. As a result, the story went, The Japanese built shiny new factories from scratch, and the victors with their musty old plants just couldn't compete. The standard economist's response to this nonsense: if that's true, all we need to do to catch up to the Japanese is just bomb our own factories. Folks who want to separate twins are making the same mistake. We always have the option of destroying in order to rebuild. But it's usually a bad idea, especially if you're destroying over the objection of the people you're trying to help. So what should we do with twins? Simple. Ask them what they want to do. If they want to stay together, keep them together. If they want to separate and develop their individuality, split them up. And if you're really sure that staying together is the wrong answer, why not try to convince us with a little self-experimentation? Cut the time you spend with your best friend in half, and tell us how you like it. December 22, 2008. The Iron Laws of Pedagogy. Everyone who's ever been a student can vouch for what I call the Iron Laws of Pedagogy. First Iron Law: students learn only a small fraction of what they're taught. Second Iron Law: students remember only a small fraction of what they learn. Third Iron Law: most of the lessons students remember lack practical applications. Research on transfer of learning strongly confirms a fourth, less obvious conclusion. Fourth Iron Law: even when students remember something with practical applications, they still usually fail to apply what they know unless you explicitly tell them to do so. If you're tempted to yawn at these truisms, reread the Fourth Iron Law. Anyone who jumps through the hoops of formal education witnesses its multiplicative inadequacies. Yet when former students argue about education policy, most fail to apply their first-hand knowledge precisely as the fourth law predicts. What do they do instead? Give in to wishful thinking and social desirability bias and hail education as the key to the universe. October 18, 2013. The Economics and Philosophy of Pity Grades. More students than I care to remember have argued with me about their grades. But there is one argument that I always dismiss out of hand. You should raise my grade because I need a higher grade. I don't do pity grading. You could argue against pity grading on reputational grounds. If employers, other schools, and parents knew that pity grading went on, it would make all grades less informative. Does this applicant have an A because he was an A student, or had a soft-hearted teacher? Did my son maintain the B average I demand through hard work, or by telling the teacher, "My dad will kick me out of the house unless you give me an A-?" I could make this argument, but it would be dishonest. The real reason I refuse to pity grade is not that it will degrade the informational value of grades. If raising a student's grade would double his lifetime income, and I knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever find out, I still wouldn't do it. So why not bend the rules? My objection to doing so is that students should get the grade they earned. And this has nothing to do with how much higher grades would benefit them. Students who demonstrate their knowledge of the material deserve high grades, and students who demonstrate their lack of knowledge deserve low grades, and that's all there is to it. In short, morally correct grading is about merit, not need. What if some students had more opportunities than others? It makes no difference. A student who does not know labor economics fails my class, even if the reason he does not know it is because he had to work 2 jobs to support his grandma. Should we take Olympic gold medals away from the children of parents who supported their dream from the cradle on? I think not. Maybe I deeply misread them, but I suspect that even most left-wing professors grade as meritocratically as I do. They may give extra help to students who come to office hours, but if a student spends 2 hours in your office every week and still fails the exam, you can't let him slide. To me, this reveals a basic inconsistency in egalitarian philosophy. If you assign grades based on merit, and merit depends on performance unadjusted for opportunity, then why shouldn't the same principle hold for income and wealth? Just because you feel sorry for someone, why does that entitle them to a share of the riches of the more successful? And if you do not adjust for unequal opportunities when you grade, why should you adjust for unequal opportunities when you contemplate redistribution? You could say that money affects people's lives more than grades, but I beg to differ. The empirical evidence cuts the other way. Job satisfaction, which probably depends heavily on having the education and grades to open up the doors you want to walk through, matters a lot more for happiness than dollars of income. So if you really wanted to even out the ultimate inequality of life, you'd redistribute grades before money. Yes, all this sounds harsh. I've never claimed to be a bleeding heart libertarian. What I will admit is that I often admire the student who comes in second despite his disadvantages more than the student who comes in first. But I see no inconsistency. Prizes are the wages of merit. Admiration is the wage of virtue. August 17, 2005. How I teach when I really want my students to learn. A month ago, my 11-year-old sons still didn't know how to tie their shoes. I volunteered to teach them. As a professional educator, I was tempted to teach shoe tying the same way I teach econ, with a scintillating lecture. Since I really wanted my sons to learn how to tie their shoes, however, I did no such thing. Instead, I followed these 6 steps. Step 1. Make the task easier. They were struggling to tie their shoes on their feet, so I had them place their shoes on the table and learn to tie them there. I also ordered easy-to-grip flat shoelaces to replace the round laces that came with the shoes. Step 2. Break shoe tying into a dozen sequential actions. Cross the laces, pull the laces tight, form left and right rabbit ears, etc. Step 3. Show them how to do the first action. Then place my hands over their hands while they do the first action. Then have them do it on their own, correcting any deviations from best practices. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Step 4. Practice only 10 minutes per day regardless of success to avoid frustration. Step 5. Once they reach near mastery on the first action, tack on the second action and go back to step 3. Keep tacking on actions until they master the whole sequence. Step 6. Now, practice the same sequence with shoes on the feet. Repeat to mastery. I almost but not quite went full behaviorist. 95% of the lesson was hands-on. Instead of lecturing, I recited shoe-tying catechisms. Make the rabbit ears. Hand 1/3 up the lace. Make the rabbit ears. 1/3, not half. Make the rabbit ears. Both ears. I never challenged my sons to ponder the deep nature of shoe-tying. I only wanted to impart the practical skill. When they made mistakes, I asked them to recite the catechism, correcting any deviations as they happened. My lessons were fully effective. Before long, my sons were experts and so they will remain for their whole lives. Which led to an awkward realization. My technique for teaching shoe tying is much more effective than my technique for teaching economics. In my experience, only 5 to 10% of my students master the material by the final exam. And even my best students tend to quickly forget most of what they learned. I'm tempted to lament the iron laws of pedagogy. But my shoe tying experience tells me that's a cop-out. I know how to make my students learn more. If filling my students with lifelong knowledge were my top priority, I'd replace my thoughtful lectures with catechisms. I'd make the students chant aloud with me. I'd break every lesson into baby steps, and drive the students to master them one by one. How? I'd randomly and mercilessly put students on the spot, pressing them to apply the lesson aloud and correct the slightest misstep. We'd meet 7 days a week for half an hour, endlessly recapping what we've learned. Sure, I'd cover far less ground. Yet after a semester, my students would know the basics for a lifetime. Why don't I do this? While I could say, the best way to teach shoe tying is radically different from the best way to teach economics, that's an excuse. The truth. I don't teach econ the same way I teach shoe tying because I'd hate it, and my students would hate me. I don't wish to be a mere drill sergeant who turns raw recruits into competent economists. I want to be an artist who turns economics into a magical journey. I want to challenge my best students, not teach to the lowest common denominator. And my students, for their part, want to sit back and relax. They don't want me to randomly shine the classroom spotlight on them, ask questions, demand answers, and make them feel stupid over and over until they know what they're talking about. One midterm, one final. That's enough stress for a semester. Now that you've heard my pedagogical confession, you might expect me to turn over a new leaf. I probably won't. I love old-fashioned teaching too much to walk away. And what's the point of adopting more effective teaching techniques if students refuse to take my classes? July 3, 2014. Teaching. Over the last 3 years, my older sons have gone from near zero knowledge of Spanish to fluency. Given my open disdain for foreign language education, what's the backstory? I started them in 9th grade because almost all good colleges impose an admission requirement of 3 to 4 years of foreign language instruction. From the outset, my boys planned to demonstrate their competence on the Spanish language AP test. Going through the motions would not suffice. We knew my sons actually had to learn a lot of Spanish. After a few sour months, fortunately, my sons started to like their new subject. Then they became obsessed in a good way. Now they've taken college classes for natives in Spain and Guatemala, written a publishable paper on Mexican history using primary sources, and mostly speak Spanish to each other. Since our emergency homeschool contains these 2 fluent Spanish speakers, I thought it might be fruitful for my older sons to teach Spanish to their younger siblings. After all, the younger ones are going to need a foreign language for college one day, too. The catch: when Spanish instruction began last week, I realized that my older sons knew Spanish, but not how to teach. As a result, I'm teaching while they're teaching Spanish. Since I've been teaching professionally for about 25 years, its principles are second nature to me. Yet if you're now teaching for the first time in your life, they're not obvious. Indeed, in my experience, over half of working teachers fail to internalize them. As Morpheus admonishes in The Matrix, Neo, sooner or later you're going to realize, just as I did, that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. Principles of effective teaching. 1. Take the difficulty level you naturally want to use. Now divide it by 10. Remember, the material is only obvious to you because you are the teacher. It is non-obvious to your students because they are the students. 2. If you're teaching at MIT or Caltech, you are now at the right difficulty level. If you're anywhere else, divide by 10 again. Remember, even smart people are, at first, terrible at almost everything. 3. Don't expect students to figure things out for themselves. Start with model problems, then work through them at a snail's pace. 4. Once you have shown students clear model problems, assign a bunch of slightly different problems. Tell them to get to work. Mush. 5. If your students do less than 75% of their problems correctly, your problems are still too hard. Walk them through problems so easy you can't even imagine their inability to do them. This will improve their knowledge and your imagination. 6. If your students do 75 to 94% of their problems correctly, give them more practice. Drill, drill, drill. 7. If your students do 95% plus of their problems correctly, they are ready to advance. Even then, remember that they are likely to forget unless you periodically give them refresher work, except for highly sequential subjects. 8. Never confuse logic with psychologic, and remember that psychology is much more important for pedagogy. What does that mean? Don't expect students to grasp that A to B simply because A greater than B. Your job is to make truisms seem obvious to ignorant minds. Vary your examples. Mix it up. Switch around. Use repetition. Use repetition. Use repetition. 9. Look at your students' faces. If they are bored, be more fun. Tell jokes. Mock yourself. Clown around. Playfully exaggerate all emotions. Throw your pride aside. A teacher is an entertainer or he is a failure. 10. Look at your students' faces. If they are frustrated, be more patient. Never add negative emotion on top of negative emotion. If a student is upset, be a model of mild-mannered stoicism. Without fail. Without fail. Without fail. 11. Look at your students' faces. If they feel like their efforts are pointless, sell them your subject. Tell them what learning your subject will do for them, even if the only honest answer is, you need this for graduation. 12. Look at your students' faces. If they don't trust you, earn their trust. Don't merely avoid deception, be frank. Don't sugarcoat the world, even for little kids. Unless the ugly truth will give them nightmares or get you fired, share it with equanimity. 13. Look at your students' faces. If you can't read their emotions, ask them questions. Press them. Find out what they already know. Find out what confuses them. Find out whether they are happy or sad or think you're crazy. Accept their answers beatifically and adjust your pedagogy to fit the students you actually have. 14. Maintain discipline. If you have a schedule, stick to it. If you announce a punishment, stick to it. If you promise a break, stick to it. Education is for the students, but it is not a democracy. Listen carefully to what your students say, but only reform from a position of strength. Don't be generous, be magnanimous. If you think this contradicts principle number 9, know that you are wrong. Act like a jester but rule like a king. 15. All of these principles are optimized for one-on-one teaching. If you're teaching more students, you have to strike a balance. You will always shortchange someone. Sorry, that's a classroom. Another point in favor of homeschooling. April 2, 2020. Why I'm homeschooling. I'm homeschooling my elder sons for middle school. On the surface, this makes sense. Homeschooling has been in the libertarian penumbra for decades. If you know my books, however, you should be puzzled. In Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, I argue that the power of nurture is vastly overrated. Genetics, not upbringing, explains almost all of the absurd similarity between parent and child. It's not reasonable, then, for me to expect my efforts to durably boost my kids' IQs, educational success, income, or even their political views. 2. In the case against education, I argue that signaling, not human capital, explains most of the effect of education on earnings. Without an established school's seal of approval, learning has little selfish payoff. So even if the Caplan family school manages to build stellar cognitive skills, the real world won't reward them. Of course, it would be deeply out of character for me to homeschool without replies to both objections. Here they are. 1. While the power of nurture to change kids' adult outcomes is indeed vastly overrated, it is well within my power to give my sons a better childhood. My kids prefer a challenging academic curriculum. I can give them that. My kids hate music, dance, art, and group projects. I can spare them these indignities. My kids don't want to wake up at 5:45 a.m. every morning. In the Caplan family school, we start at a civilized hour. Homeschooling gives my sons plenty of time for math, reading, and history, but leaves them ample free time for hobbies and travel. More speculative. I suspect, though I'm far from sure, that the Caplan family school is such an exceptional experience that ordinary twin and adoption evidence isn't relevant. For example, my sons are plausibly the only 12-year-olds in the nation taking a college class in labor economics. Perhaps it really will forever rock their worlds. More obviously, their peer group now includes Robin Hanson, Alex Tabarrok, Tyler Cowen, Garrett Jones, and Nathaniel Beckhofer. That's plausibly 4 standard deviations above whatever peer group they'd have in a conventional middle school. 2. While education is mostly signaling, there are cracks in the system. As far as I can tell, the real world pays zero attention to what students do in middle school. The Caplan family school won't keep my kids out of good high schools. They can re-enter Fairfax County Public School in 9th grade. It won't keep my kids out of good colleges. Colleges don't know what applicants did in middle school. And it won't keep my kids from getting good jobs. There probably isn't an employer in the country who asks how applicants did in 7th grade. So while homeschooling feels risky for high school, our next 2 years look like clear sailing. If my reasoning sounds familiar, it should. I'm a strategic nonconformist. When I can bend stupid rules with impunity, I bend them. September 22, 2015. The world's worst argument against homeschooling. I've heard many arguments against homeschooling. Here's the worst. Bryan, you've got to send your kids back to public high school. Why? Well, you've got to understand that high school is miserable. I remember it well. How is that an argument for high school? Because it prepares you for the misery of life. Having a job is just like being in high school. Without that preparation, you'll never make it in the real world. The obvious objection. Suppose your kid is incredibly happy in high school. Everyone's nice and encouraging. He's learning piles of material. Day after day, he comes home and says, high school is a dream come true. What kind of a parent would react not with elation, but alarm? As in, eek, my kid may be excelling academically, but he's totally not being prepared for the harshness of adult life. I got to immediately move him to a school where he's unhappy for his own good. None I've ever encountered. Sure, parents occasionally sentence their kids to military school, but they do so because the kid is behaving badly now, not because they fear they're studious, Well-mannered kids will grow up to be snowflakes. So what's the best argument against homeschooling? Conformity signaling, of course. April 27, 2017. Unschooling plus math. One popular variant of homeschooling is called unschooling. The practice varies, as practices always do. The essence, however, is that the student does what he wants. He studies what he wants. He studies for as long as he wants. If he asks you to teach him something, you teach him. Yet, if he decides to play video games all day, the principled unschooling response is, let him. Almost every parent is horrified by the idea of unschooling. Even most homeschoolers shake their heads. Advocates insist, however, that unschooling works. Psychologist Peter Gray defends the merits of unschooling with great vigor and eloquence. According to unschoolers, the human child is naturally curious. Given freedom, he won't just learn basic skills, he'll ultimately find a calling. On the surface, unschooling sounds like social desirability bias run amok. Oh yes, every child loves to learn, it's just society that fails them. And as a mortal enemy of social desirability bias, my instinct is to dismiss unschooling out of hand. One thing I loathe more than social desirability bias, however, is refusing to calm down and look at the facts. Fact. I personally met and conversed with dozens of adults who were unschooled. Overall, they appear at least as well educated as typical graduates from the public school system. Indeed, as Gray would predict, unschoolers are especially likely to turn their passions into careers. Admittedly, some come across as flaky, but then again so do a lot of young people. When you look closely, unschoolers have only one obvious problem. They're weak in math. In my experience, even unschoolers with stellar IQs tend to be weak in algebra. Algebra, I say, and their knowledge of more advanced mathematics is sparser still. Staunch unschoolers will reply, so what? Who needs algebra? The honest answer, though, is anyone who wants to pursue a vast range of high-status occupations. STEM requires math. CS requires math. Social science requires math. Even sophisticated lawyers, the kind that discuss investments and net present values, require math. Won't kids who would greatly benefit from math choose to learn math given the freedom to do so? The answer, I fear, is rarely. For two reasons. First, math is extremely unfun for almost everyone. Only a handful of nerds sincerely find the subject engaging. I'm a big nerd, and I've done piles of math, yet I've never really liked it. Second, math is highly cumulative. Each major stage of math builds on the foundation of the previous stages. If you reach adulthood and then decide to learn math to pursue a newly discovered ambition, I wish you good luck, because you'll need it. What's the best response? Mainstream critics of unschooling will obviously use this criticism to dismiss the entire approach. And staunch unschoolers will no doubt stick to their guns. I, however, propose a keyhole solution. I call it unschooling plus math. What does unschooling plus math mean? Simple. Impose a single parental mandate on unschooled children. Every day, like it or not, you have to do 1 to 2 hours of math. No matter how boring you find the subject, you're too young to decide that you don't want to pursue a career that requires math. And if you postpone the study of math for long, it will be too late to start later on. While most people don't wind up using much math on the job, ignorance of basic math is still a severe handicap in life. And when smart kids don't know advanced math, they forfeit about half of all high-status career opportunities. We should have a strong presumption against paternalism, even the literal paternalism of a parent for his own child. Maybe the kid is right and the parent is wrong is a deeply underrated thought. The value of math, however, is great enough to overcome this presumption. To be clear, I don't mean that the government should force homeschoolers to teach math. What I mean, rather, is that homeschoolers should require their kids to learn math. Guilt-free. October 27, 2020. Real subjects have no arbiter. When you challenge the morality of the status quo, people usually leap to its defense. After a few rounds of argument, though, defenders of the status quo often retreat to meta-ethics. Maybe immigration restrictions do seem wrong, but how are we to decide? Who precisely is the arbiter of right and wrong? Faced with this question, I've long given the same answer. No one is the arbiter of right and wrong. Individuals just have to consider the moral issue and form their best judgment. That hardly makes morality subjective. There's no arbiter of scientific or historical truth, either. I now realize that my answer could have been stronger all along. Yes, there's no arbiter of scientific truth, of historical truth, of moral truth. But what truths, if any, do have an arbiter? When, if ever, is there a decider of truth? There is a simple answer. Arbiters do indeed exist, but only for purely social truths. If your question is, are Jack and Mary married? An arbiter might exist. After all, to be married is nothing more than to be considered married by a society. If the people in a society accept the Grand Poobah as the arbiter of marriage, then whatever he decides about two people's marital status is their true marital status. Similarly, if the people of the United States accept the Supreme Court as the arbiter of constitutionality, then it is the arbiter. If people play a game where the rules say the game master is always right, then the game master is the arbiter of that game. Etc. What do all these arbiters have in common? Simple. Their subjects are all make-believe to begin with. That's why one person's judgment can be decisive. One version of let's pretend is let's pretend that whatever X says is true. Fake subjects can have arbiters because there are no underlying facts to get in the way. The converse is also true. If a subject has an arbiter, that subject is fake. The fact that one person's say-so decides an issue reveals the make-believe nature of the issue. Picture how you'd react if someone claimed to be the arbiter of math. Impossible, right? But why? Because math is a real subject with real answers that are right or wrong no matter what anyone thinks. When people ask, who's the arbiter of morality? The correct answer is indeed, no one. But this answer, though correct, is woefully incomplete. The critic's insinuation that morality is subjective because it lacks an arbiter is the opposite of the truth. If morality had an arbiter, that would be a conclusive sign of its subjectivity. The fact that morality lacks an arbiter is one sign, though hardly a conclusive one, that morality, like science, history, and math, has answers that no one's mere say-so can undo. June 25, 2012. 7 Guidelines for Writing Worthy Works of Nonfiction. I try to write the kind of books I'd like to read, and I try to read the kind of books I'd like to write. This isn't as narcissistic as it sounds. I'd like to write like Tolstoy or Alan Moore or Stephen Landsberg, but I have to settle for being me. As far as fiction goes, I don't have enough experience to pontificate. But I propose the following guidelines for writing worthy works of nonfiction. 1. Pick an important topic. If someone asks you, what are the 5 most important areas to think about, and you're writing about something that isn't on your own list, you should be disturbed. How do you know if a topic is important? My test. If everyone on Earth read your book and believed it, would it make the world a better place? Note. That's a test of importance, not truth. 2. Learn a lot about your topic. Start with standard academic literature, but don't stop there. Cast a wider net. See if other disciplines study your topic under a different label. See what smart people throughout history thought about your topic. See what non-academics think too, even if they seem like idiots. 3. Keep telling yourself. Once I perfect the organization of my book, it will practically write itself. If you're deviating from your own plan, either stop or change your plan. Related hypothesis. The main cause of non-fiction writer's block is lack of a clear chapter structure. 4. Never preach to the choir. It's impossible to be convincing to everyone. But if you haven't made a persuasive case to the reader who doesn't initially agree with you, start over. Remember, you're writing a book, not a diary. 5. When in doubt, write like Hemingway. If you can delete a word without changing the meaning of a sentence, do so. 6. Treat specific intellectual opponents with respect, in print and otherwise, even if they don't reciprocate. But feel free to ridicule ridiculous ideas. 7. Don't keep your cards close to your chest. Share your sincere probabilities with your readers. Don't just tell them what you can prove. Tell them anything interesting that you're willing to bet on and at what odds. October 21, 2009. Part 4. How to Dale Carnegie. If the angry could hear what the calm do not say. Dear angry person. I can tell that you're angry at me again. I think I understand your complaint, though I have trouble understanding why this specific issue is upsetting you on this specific day. But based on past experience, asking for clarification will only make you angrier, without helping me avoid your future anger. As usual, then, I plan to appease you. But in the silence of my mind, I've got a question for you. In all the years we've known each other, how many times have I expressed anger at you? By my count, the answer is 0. Question. Do you think that's because your behavior is above reproach? Do you imagine I'm entirely satisfied with the way you've treated me? Well, I'm not. Your emotional abuse aside, you failed to meet my expectations more than once. So why haven't I ever raised my voice at you? Indeed, why do I normally act as if everything you do is unobjectionable? 7 main reasons. Nobody's perfect. I take a moderate amount of bad behavior for granted, and count myself lucky it's not worse. 2. Assessing behavior is surprisingly ambiguous. Real life is not a math exam. While bad behavior plainly exists, even decent people frequently see the world differently, an insight that inspired game theorists to develop the notion of trembling hands equilibria. In such an environment, interpreting people's actions charitably is advisable, especially for people with a long, admirable track record. 3. While getting angry often changes behavior for the better, getting angry also often changes behavior for the worse. Net effect? Unclear. 4. Getting angry is far from the only way to change behavior for the better. So in the subset of situations where anger is an effective motivator, you still have to ask, does it motivate better than these alternatives? The answer, once again, is unclear. 5. Even when anger is the best short-run strategy, it damages long-run relationships. And I value these long-run relationships more than I value winning any specific dispute. 6. Getting angry clouds your thinking, leading to intellectual and moral error. And 2 of my chief life goals are being right and acting rightly. 7. All else aside, getting angry is aversive for me. I don't love to hate anything or anyone. I wish to live in harmony with others, especially people I know personally. As I rattle off these points in my head, I nervously visualize you getting angrier. So as usual, I'm not going to tell you what I'm really thinking. Still, after making full allowance for, 2, here's a harsh truth. When you kill the messenger, your ignorance is culpable. Your obliviousness to my concerns is a vice. Calm people like me deserve better. Sincerely. Calm person. November 22, 2016. The silent suffering of the non-neurotic. Negative emotions like sadness, anger, and fear tend to come as a package. Personality psychologists call this package neuroticism. There's a spectrum, of course. At the high end of neuroticism, we have people like Seinfeld's George Costanza, who finds misery and outrage wherever he turns. At the low end, we have people like Seinfeld's Cosmo Kramer, who discovers amusement and excitement around every corner. Having a neurotic personality is not fun, and neurotics rarely let us forget it. This doesn't imply, however, that they're victims. By acting on their sadness, anger, and fear, neurotics routinely make the people around them sadder, angrier, and more fearful. Parallel claims hold for non-neurotics. They rarely complain, but that doesn't imply they're not victims. How exactly does society victimize the non-neurotic? Look at the news or, in an election year, politics. It's a parade of stories crafted to make every onlooker feel sadness, anger, and fear. It's a pan-ideological problem. Left and right disagree on many things, but both tribes of activists want you to get upset about something every day. Take a look at the stories your friends shared on Facebook today. How many aren't a thinly veiled demand for negative affect? If your neuroticism is high or even average, you probably aren't even aware that you're imposing on others. For you, calling on people to be sad, angry, or afraid is on par with asking them to walk with their eyes open. And since non-neurotics aren't prone to complain, it's easy to remain oblivious to their concerns. Actually, as a self-identified non-neurotic, I should say, our concerns. Though I loathe to complain, I can't stand to see my people suffer any longer. Sadness, anger, and fear do not come naturally to us. We don't love to hate things. And though we are happy to lend a sympathetic and constructive ear to your concrete problems, We don't want to be part of the vicissitudes of your abstract offense. I know neurotics are highly unlikely to change their personalities, but it would be nice if you showed us non-neurotics a little consideration. And we so rarely ask for anything. Without reproach, I ask you this. Please, stop trying to make us feel what you feel. Thanks in advance. November 15, 2016. A.B.A. Always be advising. I often annoy other economists by giving advice. Economists are supposed to describe behavior, not change it, they insist. But they couldn't be more wrong. Economics is inherently advisory. Anytime an economist notices a discrepancy between A, the world as it is, and B, the world as people believe it to be, economics implies advice. Suppose an economist knows that the true price of driving a mile is 25 cents. If X falsely believes that the price is 23 cents per mile, the economist has every right to tell him, you drive too much. Too much by what standard? By whatever standards X happens to hold. On the other hand, if X falsely believes that the price is 27 cents per mile, the economist has every right to tell him, you drive too little. Too little by what standard? By whatever standards X happens to hold. The same applies if X under or overestimates the toxicity of cigarettes, the distance from Boston to New York, or the probability of getting tenure. If you overestimate costs or underestimate benefits, economics tells you to start doing more. If you underestimate costs or overestimate benefits, economics tells you to start doing less. Notice the huge difference between economic advice and, say, medical advice. The typical doctor will tell you, cigarettes are bad for your health, so stop smoking. For an economist to give smoking advice, in contrast, he needs to know more than the mere fact that smoking has a downside. He needs to discover a discrepancy between actual and perceived downsides. Do you underestimate the health risks of smoking? Then economics tells you to smoke less. Do you overestimate the health risks of smoking? Then economics tells you to smoke more. Unlike doctors, economists know how to give advice and respect pluralism at the same time. Of course, a long list of caveats is implicit. If you're making a discrete choice, you need to interpret buy more as be more willing to buy and buy less as be less willing to buy. If you simply don't enjoy a product, you should interpret buy more as buy the same or more. If some people overestimate and others underestimate, you need to give the two groups opposite advice. Etc. It's okay to quibble, but the logic of what Patrick Friedman calls directional rationality is hard to escape. Bottom line. Once you discover a discrepancy between the world as it is and the world as people perceive it to be, economic science and economic advice are perfectly compatible. The only economists who should give no advice are the freakishly unperceptive souls who have failed to discover a single discrepancy between the world as it is and the world as people perceive it to be. July 5, 2011. The Charge of Creepiness. CK, an Econ log reader, writes, I find your obsession with the topic of people's personal choices to be deeply creepy. Also, the fact that your starting point is that they are in error is a textbook example of bad logic, e.g., assuming what you need to prove. Furthermore, it is highly against the logic of economics to assume that you know people's preferences and or utility function better than they do, cf. Consumer sovereignty. I'm not sure how many other people find my obsession creepy, but I doubt that CK is alone. My defense. I don't see why it's any more creepy to give advice about family size than advice about personal finance or home theater design. I'm not trying to bully anyone, just share some relevant arguments and evidence with the world. What's wrong with that? Perhaps the complaint is that having a child is much more personal than picking a mutual fund or a high-definition projector. I agree with the premise that having a child is especially personal. But that's no reason to spurn advice, as I explain in the preface to Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Work in Progress. Whether to have a child is obviously one of life's most personal decisions. Just because a decision is personal, however, does not mean that whatever decision you make is the right one for you. Precisely because the decision to have a child is complicated, its consequences are easy to misjudge. Your personal decision can be way off, and if you make up your mind too quickly, you're only cheating yourself. Is it creepy to claim to know someone's preferences, utility function better than they do? A key point in my argument is that I don't need to claim any such thing. When an economist tells you to diversify your portfolio, he isn't trying to overrule your values. He's trying to explain the best way to achieve your values. The same thing goes with my advice about family size. I've also noticed that some libertarians see my arguments as somehow unlibertarian. But I've never called for government to pressure people into having children. Indeed, I favor many policy changes that I admit are anti-natalist, such as abolishing public schooling. The key point, though, is that there's nothing unlibertarian about giving advice. So is there anything creepy about my project? I just don't see it. I'll admit there's such a thing as unwanted advice. Face to face, I rarely give advice unless someone asks for it. But what could be less obtrusive than putting advice in writing on a blog, where the curious can read it, and the not-so-curious can scroll down to the next post? January 26, 2009. Pax Libertaria. As a rule, I dislike shouting matches. But I especially dislike shouting matches between people I largely agree with. As a libertarian, this puts me in an uncomfortable position, because many libertarians seem to relish shouting matches even, or especially, with other libertarians. What is so bad about shouting matches? First, they aren't persuasive to people who don't already agree with you. In other words, they aren't persuasive at all. Second, giving in to anger makes it harder to tell the truth from falsehood. Third, as someone other than Buddha said, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The main person who suffers when you're angry is you. Fourth, assuming both sides share worthwhile goals, shouting matches have a clear deadweight cost. The time you spend shouting at each other could have been spent cooperating to accomplish something good. Or at least independently accomplishing distinct good things. If my assessment is correct, why do people ever engage in shouting matches? While I can imagine someone defending shouting matches on their merits, the main excuse I hear is, the other side started it. One problem with this story is that both sides usually have some reason to point fingers. Take the recent debate on the shortage of libertarian women. While I disagree with much of Thomas Woods's reply, this passage resonated with me. Julie's critics can't conclude their attack without unbosoming the lasting trauma of the whole episode for them. Today, because of Julie's video, they're a little embarrassed to admit they're libertarians. Poor babies. To my knowledge, they have not expressed any embarrassment when libertarians have, for example, gratuitously insulted the religious beliefs of tens of millions of Americans in crude and ignorant ways. I suppose that's designed to bring people into the fold? The sensible lesson to draw, of course, would be that libertarians should stop gratuitously insulting anyone. But if you stick to, who started gratuitously insulting people, Woods could easily be correct. Indeed, in the past I have personally been guilty of gratuitously insulting common religious beliefs, for no good reason. I apologize. If you're really going to persist in a shouting match on the grounds that the other side started it, it's quite possible that detailed historical investigation will reveal that your side started it. Worse, much depends on how you define the sides. In any case, if shouting matches are as counterproductive as I claim, it makes little difference who first left the path of civility. It really does take two to tango. If you find yourself in a shouting match, search your own words and behavior to see if you have needlessly provoked your opponents. Perhaps an apology is in order. If you're ambivalent, the wise err on the side of contrition. If, after a healthy adjustment for self-serving bias, you find yourself above reproach, it still pays to turn the other cheek, to talk to your opponent as if he were your best friend. While you'll still probably fail to persuade, you drastically increase your prospects. The point of the shouting match isn't to persuade the other side. It's to persuade spectators that I shouldn't be blamed for the other side's embarrassing words. Perhaps. But if spectators are that easily confused, it's probably more effective to get the other side to stop embarrassing you. If so, which sounds more effective to you? Stop embarrassing me, you horrible excuse for a libertarian. Or, 2 of my opponent's 7 complaints about me are fair, and I'm going to stop doing these 2 things. Note that I say more effective, not fully effective or even highly effective. As far as I know, there are no highly effective methods of persuasion in these matters. But some remain better than others. My claims about shouting matches are completely general. But of course I'm most eager to end shouting matches between people close to me. Accordingly I propose a Pax Libertaria, a libertarian peace. The terms of the peace. Individual libertarians unilaterally pledge to diffuse shouting matches by a. meticulously searching their own words and actions for shortcomings, b. erring strongly on the side of making amends for their arguable shortcomings, and c. turning the other cheek when the other side shouts at them despite their blamelessness. This could mean ignoring the other side, or politely responding to their substantive arguments without further comment. To avoid misunderstanding, the Pax Libertaria certainly doesn't follow from libertarian principles. People have every right to engage in shouting matches, no matter how destructive. But as libertarians often say, the fact that you have a right to do X does not mean that it is right for you to do X. The Pax Libertaria is a roadmap to peace for libertarians. It's an attempt to increase the effectiveness of libertarian persuasion by reducing the frequency of libertarian infighting. If the Pax Libertaria seems like it's asking a lot, I say you have nothing to lose but your anger. Give Pax a chance. January 7, 2013. Conversion. The quantity-quality trade-off. Confession. Whenever I write, I'm looking for converts. I don't just want to share some information. I want to change how my readers think and how they see themselves. When I read other proselytizing thinkers, however, I cringe. I cringe not merely because I disagree with their conclusions. And I certainly don't object to the conversion motive itself. I cringe, rather, because my competitors seem far too focused on the quantity of their converts rather than their quality. How can I tell? If your main goal is to convince as many people as possible, you naturally focus on emotional appeals, especially to anger, fear, and disgust. Everyone feels these emotions, so everyone's a potential convert. If you bother making arguments at all, build your case around vivid stories, not step-by-step arguments. Don't bother trying to pass an ideological Turing test for opposing views, you'll just confuse your audience. In fact, don't bother anticipating and answering the best objections to your views. Just troll and move on. Why respond to arguments most of your potential converts have never even heard? In contrast, if your main goal is to improve the intellectual quality of people on your side, you do the opposite. Start by urging your allies to calm down, because anger, fear, and disgust impede careful reasoning. Then, review popular arguments for your allies' views and point out flaws in said arguments. Finally, offer better arguments and more reasonable conclusions. Along the way, you'll eagerly address the best objections you've encountered and try to present them as skillfully as their best advocates. By the end, most of your potential audience will have wandered away in anger, fear, and disgust. But the few who remain will be better thinkers and better people. I can't honestly claim to focus solely on quality. Frankly, it gets a little dull. But from where I'm standing, most public intellectuals focus almost exclusively on quantity. This is hardly surprising for slower-witted pundits. Maybe they can't do any better. But when I see brilliant minds demagoguing, I'm aghast. Even if they made converts by the boatload, I'd be ashamed to emulate them. Admittedly, you could accuse me of sour grapes. My quantity conversion skills are, at best, weak. My quality conversion skills, in contrast, are pretty good. Give me an hour with someone who sympathizes with my general views, and I can reliably inculcate more reasonable versions of those views. And if you give me 10 minutes every day on Econ log, I can do much more. You will not be numerous, my readers. But you will be marvelous. December 8, 2016. Say it loud, say it proud. If you were in marketing, would you take this advice? To raise the status of intelligence and analytical thinking, don't. Stand for instrumental rationality, for science, for attitudes which go beyond traditional religion, for the conquering of limits, for probabilistic reasoning, and for the notion that the subject sees hidden possibilities and resources which more traditional observers do not. Instead, give to mainstream charity. 2. If you value economics, keep it to yourself. If you are the economically informed member of your family, or perhaps even an economist, don't flaunt it. Hide its universal nature or widespread applicability. Do not present economic wisdom as a matter of principle or a general way of thinking about life. If you're a libertarian, stop attacking the New Deal and jump on the scare of the weak bandwagon. I would like to restructure classical liberalism, or libertarianism, whatever we call it, around these new and very serious threats to liberty. Let's not fight the last battle or the last war. Let's not obsess over all the interventions represented by the New Deal, even though I would agree that most of those policies were bad ideas. The source of all three pieces of advice is my colleague Tyler Cowen. Notice the pattern? In each case, he urges people to whom he's officially sympathetic to abandon their main arguments without argument, and try to curry favor by doing and saying normal things. Frankly, I can't imagine marketing experts recommending a Cohenian approach. Instead, they'd tell you the obvious. If you've got good ideas to sell, don't be shy. Affably explain why you're right and your critics are wrong. Say it loud and say it proud. Once you reach market saturation, you might want to mix up your marketing a bit. But until you're a household name, clearly and boldly make your point. And remember, there's no point in pandering to those who will never buy your product, anyway. July 10, 2010. Rand vs. Evolutionary Psychology. Part 1. I want you to observe that those who cry the loudest about their disillusionment, about the failure of virtue, the futility of reason, the impotence of logic, are those who have achieved the full, exact, logical result of the ideas they preached, so mercilessly logical that they dare not identify it. Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. The new Rand bio, Ann Heller's Ayn Rand and the World She Made, is almost hypnotic. I read over 200 pages yesterday, finished the book at 1 a.m., and woke up 2 hours early thinking about it. While I already knew all the main facts and most of the details, Heller's a great storyteller, especially after the first 2 chapters. The highlight is her account of the rise and fall of the New York objectivist movement. It's a story of scary contrasts between theory and reality. The most striking: Rand and her closest followers were supposed to be amazingly happy because of their uniquely rational philosophy, but in practice they were openly angry and secretly miserable. What went wrong? It is easy to account for some of the facts on strictly Randian lines. Nathaniel and Barbara Brandon were Rand's closest followers. Nathaniel began an affair with Rand, and Barbara consented, even though Barbara hated the idea from the start and Nathaniel quickly lost interest in his aging mistress. In so doing, the Brandons betrayed their principles. They failed to stand up for their own interests and wound up habitually lying to her. Rand's view of happiness is a state of non-contradictory joy, a joy without penalty or guilt, a joy that does not clash with any of your values and does not work for your own destruction, specifically predicts that the Brandons would be anguished as a result. So far, so good. But why would the Brandons feel the slightest temptation to deviate from objectivist principles? And why was Rand herself so unhappy? Heller writes, most of the time, she was adamant that her emotional condition was a natural response to intolerable circumstances. However, she leaned more heavily on her heir, Nathaniel Brandon, for aid in entangling her premises, some of which she sometimes conceded must be wrong. I have a simple explanation for all of these patterns. Objectivists defied the many truisms about human nature that evolutionary psychology later came to explain. Truisms like 1. Good looks and youth are very important for sexual attraction, especially from a male point of view. 2. People feel jealous when their mates have sex with other people. 3. Lying is often a convenient way to avoid your mate's jealousy. On the Randian view, a man's sexual choice is the result and the sum of his fundamental convictions. So why wouldn't her affair with Nathaniel be a great success? Their shared fundamental convictions should cause enduring love, never mind the 25-year age difference. Barbara has no reason to resent sharing her husband. In fact, she should be flattered that the great Rand so admires him. And of course, if Nathaniel wanted to end the affair, he would have no motive to lie, because Rand would not be jealous of any woman fit to replace her. Unfortunately for Rand, her theory smashes against billions of years of evolution. Yes, mutual admiration and shared values have something to do with sexual attraction. But humans with Rand-approved emotions would have been at a massive reproductive disadvantage. Men don't get descendants by pursuing 50-year-old women, no matter how brilliant they are. Jealousy also serves a vital evolutionary function. It protects men from cuckoldry, and women from sharing or losing the support of the father of her children. Trying to argue people out of these extremely adaptive feelings or pretend they don't exist is absurd. Heller shows that even Rand wasn't able to completely ignore common sense. She brought up the age difference before she started the affair, and occasionally wondered whether it bothered Nathaniel. But when he said it didn't matter, she took his word for it. Surely her greatest disciple wouldn't lie merely to avoid her jealous wrath? So how exactly does evolutionary psychology explain the misery, the jealousy, the lying? When Rand and her followers tried to wish away obvious facts about humans' emotional constitution, their feelings didn't change. But they made each other miserable pretending that they felt the way they were supposed to feel. Rand and Nathaniel had to pretend that Nathaniel was attracted to Rand. Their spouses had to pretend that they weren't jealous. Rand and Nathaniel had to pretend that they believed that their spouses weren't jealous. The more they tried to talk themselves into having feelings contrary to human nature, the worse they felt. Nathaniel coped not by admitting error, but by finding a mistress and lying to cover it up. Since Rand had already ruled out the obvious explanation for Nathaniel's behavior, she went on a wild goose chase to find the real explanation. Etc. Sigh. As Rand says, acts cannot be altered by a wish, but they can destroy the wisher. I give her a lot of credit for emphasizing that human beings are potentially rational animals. But she evaded, the fact that human beings are invariably animals and paid the price. January 12, 2020. Rand versus Evolutionary Psychology. Part 2. I want you to observe that those who cry the loudest about their disillusionment, about the failure of virtue, the futility of reason, the impotence of logic are those who have achieved the full, exact, logical result of the ideas they preached, so mercilessly logical that they dare not identify it. Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand praised the virtues of individualism and independence to the skies. In Atlas Shrugged, philosopher Hugh Axton tells Dagny, "Consider the reasons which make us certain that we are right but not the fact that we are certain. If you are not convinced, ignore our certainty. Don't be tempted to substitute our judgment for your own." Her heroes do whatever they think is right, regardless of what anyone else thinks. It's quite a vision. In the late 1950s, Rand's writings inspired a full-blown objectivist counterculture centered around New York City. And what did this counterculture look like? Ann Hiller's excellent Ayn Rand and the world she made paints a frightening picture. The counterculture didn't just fall short of the Randian virtues. It radically contradicted them. During Saturday night socials with members of the collective, Rand's inner circle of followers, and their spouses, friends, and younger guests, enormous enthusiasm was expected for her every deed and utterance. Brandon told an audience in 1996. She discouraged the kind of probing or invalid questions that she had been happy to answer in the 1950s. Rand increasingly judged her votaries' merit on the basis of their sense of life, or subconscious attitude toward the grandeur and perfectibility of man, and encouraged them to do the same with one another. The new emphasis on sense of life placed devotees' longings, fears, tastes, sexual impulses, anything, on the table for approval or condemnation. Most people were walking on eggshells, recalled Henry Holzer, who joined the inner circle as Rand's intellectual bodyguard. Just a few examples. A slip of the tongue by an objectivist who liked Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho or who secretly didn't like the paintings of Spanish surrealist José Manuel Capuletti, could bring accusations of mysticism, whim worship, malevolence, or an attitude of anti-life. If a transgression suggested disloyalty or simply that someone was not my kind of person, often no amount of prior goodwill made any difference. She was the evil Knievel of leaping to conclusions, said Hessen, who himself went through a number of painful episodes. Although she typically forgave isolated lapses, tantrums and purges became more common in the late 1960s. While Heller quotes Nathaniel Branden, her sources reveal that he was probably worse than Rand herself. It was typically Branden who took charge of the denunciation of followers who had strayed, and sometimes he revealed information from his therapy sessions with them. There was very little psychological privacy in those days, he offered as an explanation to an interviewer in 1999. Everything that was wrong with anybody or was thought to be wrong was publicly discussed. By the early 1960s, he was constantly denouncing, Barbara recalled, and because he was everybody's therapist, his denunciation was much more damaging than Annie's. I attended the official Objectivist summer seminar back in 1989, the year of the David Kelly purge, and everything that Heller writes fits my experience. Okay, so Ayn Rand created a cult. What does this have to do with evolutionary psychology? Simple. Contrary to Rand, the fact that human beings care about the opinions of the people around them doesn't stem from philosophical error. It stems from evolution. Human beings evolved in small groups where good relations were vital for survival. People who weren't interested in other people's opinions had trouble staying alive and reproducing. Caring about the opinions of others isn't as immutable as our sexual preferences, but it's very deeply rooted. Consider. How much would I have to pay you to walk in front of an audience of 100 strangers and make a fool of yourself? Rand was no exception. She thought that her affair with Brandon was morally above reproach, but made every effort to keep it secret. Why? Because unlike John Galt, she shared our normal human concern about the opinions of other people, including complete strangers. Another thought struck her and put her in a panic. If he had been underhanded enough to deceive her about his feelings toward her for months or years on end, what else might he be capable of? Would he do something terrible to embarrass her in public or discredit her ideas? I can't predict what he'll do, and I'm terrified of what may happen to my name and reputation. She cried in despair. Growing tired and tearful as the night wore on, she murmured, "My life is over. He took away this earth." If people really could stop caring about other people's opinions, Rand's counterculture never would have gotten off the ground. Within 5 minutes, prospective members would have adamantly disagreed with Rand about something or other, and she would have purged them. Her counterculture took root precisely because even avowed individualists will feign agreement in order to fit in. Ironically, individualist doctrine made the Randian counterculture especially totalitarian. Most normal movements explicitly accept appeals to authority, consensus, civility, etc. So while they're bossy, they don't ask their members to live a lie. Catholics can freely admit that the Pope is in charge. What the Pope says, goes. Objectivists, in contrast, couldn't just honestly submit to Rand's authority. They had to pretend to accept all of Rand's positions on their merits. If Rand really wanted to build an individualist subculture, she would have done so in an evolutionarily informed way. If people naturally care about the opinions of others, jumping on people is a good way to get dishonest conformity, but a bad way to get an honest exchange of ideas. Instead, an individualist subculture must be built upon tolerance and honesty. I'd suggest 3 key norms. Don't think less of people who sincerely disagree. Do you think less of people who insincerely agree? Do you think less of people who think less of people who sincerely disagree? I don't claim that these norms are easy. It's tough for humans to follow them perfectly. But they're doable, and given human nature, they're self-reinforcing. In fact, these guidelines are pillars of the legendary GMU lunch. Our tradition is now in its 13th year, and I'm proud to say that unlike the objectivists, we've never purged a member. January 29, 2010. The futility of quarreling when there is no surplus to divide. Imagine 2 people have the following relationship options. Option A. Date. Option B. Be friends. Option C. Stop seeing each other. Person number 1's preference ordering is A, C, B. In English, number 1 most prefers to date, and least prefers to just be friends. Person number 2's preference ordering is B, C, A. In English, number 2 most prefers to just be friends, and least prefers to date. In popular stereotypes, person number 1 is male, and person number 2 is female. But role reversal is probably common, too. Given these preferences, anything other than C naturally leads to bad feelings. Person number 1 resents being stuck in the friend zone. Person number 2 resents person number 1's view that being friends is an imposition or probationary situation. It's easy to see how they might angrily quarrel with each other, with person number 1 harping on his superiority to whoever person number 2 dates, and person number 2 pointing out that person number 1 should be grateful for their friendship. The fight could get really ugly, as in the webcomic The Friend Zoner vs. Nice Guy. On reflection, though, this quarreling is the epitome of futility. Sure, argument has been known to change preferences. But these preferences? Is number one really going to argue number two into feeling attracted to him when she's not? Is number two really going to argue number one out of his feelings of yearning and rejection? Extremely unlikely. Quarreling is ultimately a form of bargaining. With preference orderings, A, C, B, and B, C, A, the only mutually beneficial bargain is ceasing to deal with each other. And since either person can instantly and unilaterally jump to C by saying, "So long, have a nice life," what's the point of quarreling to get there? If you're deeply economistic, you'll naturally ask, why not consider option D, side payments? If you agree to just be friends, I'll do your laundry, or if you agree to date, I'll pay for every meal. But in many cases, if not most, offering or accepting side payments feels so degrading that neither side can accept it. Option D is off the table because the parties' expanded rankings are A, C, B, D, and B, C, A, D. Needless to say, people have imperfect information about other people's preferences. Indeed, people have imperfect information about their own preferences. Yet in many real-world relationships, preferences are fairly obvious, and my analysis applies. I suspect that many non-economists will dismiss this whole approach as overly analytical. I beg to differ. Widespread futile quarreling is a strong sign that emotional approaches have failed. The only way out is to calm down and admit that bad matches aren't anyone's fault. When two people want incompatible things, they should politely say goodbye and move on with their lives. Almost everyone can see this by the time they're 40. With economics by your side, you can attain this enlightened state at once. February 11, 2014. Malevolence and Misunderstanding. Lancelot, your rage has unbalanced you. You, sir, would fight to the death, against a knight who is not your enemy. Over a stretch of road you could easily ride around. Arthur, so be it. To the death. Excalibur. Question number 1. How many times in your life have you lost a friend because one of you malevolently decided to hurt the other? Question number 2. How many times in your life have you lost a friend over a misunderstanding? I am glad to report that I have lost a few friends in my life. But as far as I can tell, all of the rare exceptions were driven by misunderstandings. Someone spoke rashly, which hurt someone's feelings, which led to retaliation, which led to more hurt feelings, and so on. Or, someone acted as they thought proper, but someone else perceived otherwise, which led to offense, which led to counter-offense. The same goes for all the people I know well. They've lost many friends, but years later they flounder to explain the casus belli. Is my corner of the world unusually free of sheer evil? Probably. Still, I doubt my experience is unusual. I bet that most readers have lost at least 5 times as many friends to misunderstandings as they have to malevolence. How can you tell the difference between malevolence and misunderstanding? Try this helpful thought experiment. Imagine both sides calmly describe what they saw with their own eyes and heard with their own ears to a neutral outsider. If the outsider would tell both sides to forget the dispute and stay friends, you had a misunderstanding. If the outsider would say, "This is a bad match," you still had a misunderstanding, just one that's likely to recur. But if the outsider would tell one of you, "Get away from this toxic person," you saw or were malevolent. Why appeal to neutral outsiders? Well, the main reason misunderstandings arise is that most human beings rush to assume malevolence. Indeed, this is built into the very concept of the misunderstanding. Sure, I sometimes speak rashly. Sure, I'm no mind reader. When my friends speak rashly to me, or fail to understand my feelings, however, the default explanation is not that they spoke hastily or failed to see the world from my perspective. The default explanation is that they consciously decided to make me suffer. Yes, it's childish to think this way. But what can I say? People are childish. Small example. Friday I was shopping with my sons. My back was hurting, so they were pushing the cart. When I got in line, a woman immediately pulled up her cart behind me. By this point, my sons were 10 feet away. When I asked her to make room for our cart, she grew angry. Well, that's strange. Even my highly visible back brace was not enough to make her wonder about my situation. When I meekly got out of the way and offered to let her go ahead of me, She huffed and moved to the next lane. To me, this was a textbook example of a misunderstanding. Still, I suspect she went home and told her family about how awful I was. I made the effort to understand where she was coming from, but somehow she gazed into the heart of a total stranger and saw malevolence. You could object, yours is hardly an original point. Parents and teachers routinely alert children to the risk of misunderstandings. Fair enough. My claim, however, is that this lesson rarely sinks in. Adults remain prone to misinterpret mere misunderstandings as malevolence. Indeed, there are mighty social and political movements that angrily strive to amplify this error, to ascribe malevolence recklessly, and demean those who ask us to mimic the perspective of a neutral outsider when conflict arises. These days, the Me Too movement is the highest profile example. When you carefully listen to the public accusations, their severity varies tremendously. The case of Bill Cosby is light years from the cases of Louis C.K. or Aziz Ansari. Is it possible that the latter two celebrities were involved in misunderstandings that bizarrely became national crises? Entirely possible, but most Me Too activists don't just gloss over this possibility. They view those who muse, maybe it's all a big misunderstanding, with hostility. At risk of creating a new misunderstanding, my reaction to most Me Too scandals is precisely, maybe it's all a big misunderstanding. Indeed, I maintain that we should presume that conflicts are misunderstandings in the absence of strong evidence to the contrary. How far should we apply this insight? Far indeed. Even tiny slights, uncharitably interpreted, often spiral out of control. So let us assess behavior with perspective and charity. Much conflict between Democrats and Republicans rests on misunderstandings. Much of the conflict between Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter rests on misunderstandings. So does much of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Indeed, part of the reason why I'm a pacifist is that so many international conflicts are plainly rooted in misunderstandings. If you can't wait to scoff, so the Nazis just had a big misunderstanding with the rest of Europe? You are fostering a misunderstanding between us. Over a stretch of road, you could easily ride around. If we fully accepted the prevalence of misunderstandings, couldn't a malevolent person take advantage of us? I'm afraid so. Fortunately, that's a minor danger compared to the opposite mistake. Remember, when you lose a friend over a misunderstanding, you don't merely mistreat a friend. You deprive yourself of friendship in a lonely world. A worse, but still tolerably good rule of thumb: if your own complaints against your former friend seem less compelling to you years later, you probably had a misunderstanding. If your complaints actually seem more compelling years later, malevolence is more plausible. September 17, 2019. How can guys be so lazy around the house? The Economist blog shares one of its favorite strategies for ramping down the gender war. Men don't need to do more housework and childcare to achieve equality. Women just need to do less. My dad used to change the oil in our family cars. I certainly don't. I suffer exactly zero shame from the fact that I don't even know how. There are specialists who do this sort of thing. Real women's liberation and gender equality will come when social expectations shift enough to allow families to guiltlessly take full advantage of the returns to specialization. But why did a gender war arise in the first place? In my view, it is largely a case of misplaced resentment. When women see how little housework men do, they interpret it as shirking, a willful violation of basic norms of decency. Men, in turn, feel unfairly maligned by the accusation, or, perhaps more often, by the stink eye. Who is right? Let me just throw away any future career in couples counseling and say, usually, men. The evidence. Look at the typical bachelor's apartment. Even when a man pays the full cost of cleanliness and receives the full benefit, he doesn't do much. Why not? Because the typical man doesn't care very much about cleanliness. When the bachelor gets married, he almost certainly starts doing more housework than he did when he was single. How can you call that shirking? I would take the woman's side if the guy actually agreed to adopt her standards. But few marriage contracts are so explicit. All that well-meaning spouses can usually do is adhere to vague norms of decency, such as the Golden Rule. The problem with applying the Golden Rule to housework is that most men already give their wives at least as much help as they would like to receive themselves. Declaring the typical man to be innocent of the accusations against him may not seem very helpful. But it is. If you think that someone is willfully shirking, you probably won't bother to bargain for better behavior. The shirker has already broken his word once. Why should you believe he'll change? In contrast, if you can accept that a person is living up to his obligations as he understands them, it's a lot easier to amicably renegotiate. Furthermore, as some fascinating research shows, the hardest problems to cope with are those you blame on other people. The false belief that your spouse is taking advantage of you isn't just bad for your marriage, it's bad for you. January 23, 2008. Dear Prudence. Would a society made up of totally selfish human beings be worse than the society we have today? Could it even function? In last week's inaugural James M. Buchanan lecture, Deirdre McCloskey seemed to think that the obvious answers were no on both counts. A society that practiced no virtue other than prudence would be a disaster. I'm not so sure. Here's the key point. Suppose you were totally selfish. What are you currently doing that isn't already in your narrow self-interest? Not stealing? You'd be risking years in jail for stuff that you could safely buy with a little work. Not lying? Ever hear of the boy who cried wolf? Not giving to charity? How much do you give as it is? Refuse to help a friend in need? Before you say it's not my problem, you'd be well advised to Google the phrase tit for tat. Frankly, your current behavior is probably very close to what prudence alone recommends. Your subjective motivation may not be selfish, but you roughly act as if you were. And if we think in terms of the selfish gene rather than the selfish individual, apparent counterexamples like parenting fall naturally into place. Now suppose we repeat this exercise for everyone alive. Holding constant other people's behavior. How would you change your behavior if you were totally selfish? If each person answers I wouldn't, then the status quo and absolute prudence are compatible. Of course, this is an oversimplification. There would be some differences. But it's hard to say whether the reign of prudence would make the world a better or worse place to live. Yes, charity to strangers would probably vanish, but selfless charity is already a pittance. And Robin Hanson points out that even the selfish rich might give to charity to signal their wealth. Drivers would be less courteous and strangers ruder to one another. But on the other hand, a world of pure prudence has obvious advantages. Imagine a world where no one was willing to die for a cause, country, religion, ethnicity, whatever. To make soldiers risk death, they'd have to start awfully poor and be richly rewarded. That sounds like a recipe for world peace to me. Similarly, imagine a world where no one would try to hurt another person out of envy or spite. A great many conflicts would vanish, for, as an ego. Montoya says in The Princess Bride, there's not a lot of money in revenge. Bottom line. A world of pure prudence would be rough around the edges. But there's no reason to think it wouldn't work, and a lot of reason to think that it would be both safer and saner than the world we see today. All you need is love? It would be prettier, but it's never going to happen. All you need is prudence, is the more realistic slogan for a better world, because it encourages people to do what they're inclined to do anyway. April 12, 2006. The Bayesian Prisoner's Dilemma. Suppose someone sends you a new article claiming X. Intuitively, we think, this will either make you more likely to believe X or have no effect. Once you understand Bayesian reasoning, however, this makes no sense. When someone sends you an article claiming X, you should ask yourself, is this evidence stronger or weaker than I would have expected? If the answer is stronger, then you should become more likely to believe X. However, if the answer is weaker, then you should become less likely to believe X. Thus, suppose you initially consider X absurd. When someone sends you some evidence in favor of X, you should update in favor of X if the evidence is less awful than expected. You should update against X, in contrast, only if the evidence is even more awful than expected. Similarly, suppose you initially consider X absurd, but your brilliant friend nevertheless defends it. The fact that a brilliant person believes X is evidence in its favor. Given his brilliance, however, his arguments should only persuade you if they are even better than you would have expected from one so brilliant. When a great mind offers mediocre arguments, you shouldn't merely be unmoved. You should be actively repelled. That's the best you can do? Example. One of the smartest people I know routinely sends me pro-social justice links on Twitter. As a result, I think even less of the movement than I previously did. If even he fails to defend his view effectively, the view is probably truly devoid of merit. What, however, should I conclude if this mighty intellect simply stopped sending me links? One possibility, of course, is that he's given up on me. Another possibility, though, is that he's exhausted his supply of evidence. At this point, he's got nothing better than nothing. The strange upshot. While Bayesian reasoning seems to imply that persuasive efforts are, on average, ineffective, there is a reason to keep arguing. Namely, failure to argue is, on average, an admission of intellectual defeat. And by basic Bayesian principles, this in turn implies that the continuation of argument is at least weak evidence in favor of whatever you're arguing. Stepping back, you can see a somewhat depressing conclusion. When people are perfect Bayesians, argument is a kind of prisoner's dilemma. If your opponent keeps arguing, you want to keep arguing so it doesn't look like you've run out of arguments. If your opponent stops arguing, you want to keep arguing to emphasize that your opponent has run out of arguments. As a result, both sides have an incentive to argue interminably. Which, as you may have noticed, they usually do. Is there any ejector seat out of this intellectual trap? Yes. You could build a credible reputation for talking only when you have something novel to add to the conversation. Then instead of interpreting your silence as, "I've got nothing," Bayesian listeners will interpret it as, "I've rested my case." Silence. July 29, 2019. Do labels and good versus evil stories drain IQ? I'm a libertarian, a natalist, an atheist, a credentialist, an economist, an optimist, a behavioral economist, an elitist, a public choicer, a dualist, a Shazian, a moral realist, an anti-communist, a pacifist, a hereditarian, a mesonomist, a moral intuitionist, a free market Keynesian, a deontologist, a modal realist, a Humerian, a Darwinian, the other kind of libertarian, equals a believer in free will, and much more. I could spend hours adding additional labels to the list, so it naturally caught my attention when Will Wilkinson remarked, "People call me libertarian, but I don't, in part because I'm not one, but mostly because I suspect that accepting any such label dings my IQ about 15 points. If the IQ ding is additive, my many labels have long since reduced me to the intelligence of a cranberry. And even if the ding isn't additive, I don't have 15 IQ points to spare. Especially not if Tyler is right about the effect of good versus evil stories on IQ. As a simple rule of thumb, just imagine every time you're telling a good versus evil story, you're basically lowering your IQ by 10 points or more. If you just adopt that as a kind of inner mental habit, it's, in my view, one way to get a lot smarter pretty quickly. You don't have to read any books. Just imagine yourself pressing a button every time you tell the good versus evil story, and by pressing that button you're lowering your IQ by 10 points or more. I'm not as big on good versus evil stories as I am on self-labeling. I strive to be friendly to everyone. I see noble adversaries, embarrassing allies, and various shades of gray. But there's a good versus evil story just below my surface, pitting reasonable, constructive, iconoclastic people who agree with me against the benighted masses and their emotional, whiny, conventional intellectual apologists. If Tyler and Will are both right, I'm down a minimum of 25 IQ points. But what reason is there to believe that either Will or Tyler is correct? There are obviously many labels and many good versus evil stories that drain your effective IQ. Think Leninist, creationist, or astrologer. But it is equally obvious that many labels and many good versus evil stories boost your effective IQ. Think behavioral economist, Darwinian, or astronomer. And yet, it moves. Will and Tyler act as if these differences don't exist. Will and Tyler might protest that the average effect of labels and good versus evil stories is to reduce effective IQ. But they'd be wrong to do so. Agnostic, neutral thinkers have little to say and less to teach. Yes, it's better to suspend judgment rather than embrace error. But intellectual progress only occurs after someone discovers and publicizes good reasons to adopt an ism. Aren't there intellectual risks of accepting labels and good versus evil stories? Sure, labels can blind us to counter-evidence. Good versus evil stories give us an excuse to damn the messenger instead of considering his message. But the wise response is to strive to compensate for these specific risks, not to salute the intellectual equivalent of the Swiss flag. Indeed, when you really think about it, labels and good versus evil stories are unavoidable. Will's implicit label is label avoidism. Tyler's implicit good versus evil story is the never-ending war between the good people who don't believe in good versus evil stories and the evil people who do. Why am I so inclined to defend labels and good versus evil stories? Because when I review my life's work, I realize that I owe my life's work to my labels and stories. You don't have to be a libertarian to appreciate the myth of the rational voter, but without my libertarian goggles I would never have conceived the project. The same goes for virtually everything I've written. You might point to something like why I am not an Austrian economist as a counterexample, but you shouldn't. I couldn't have written that piece if I weren't a lapsed Austrian, and wouldn't have written it if I didn't have a superior alternative and label to offer. Labels and good versus evil often effectively drain IQ. Many drain 25 points or more. But there's no substitute for actually examining the specific content of the labels and stories. Stupid worldviews reduce IQ. Smart worldviews raise IQ. Declaring a plague on all your houses solves nothing. April 9, 2012. I was a teenage misanthrope. When I was a teenager, I viewed all of the following with antipathy. Students not in honors classes, heavy metal fans, people who disliked classical music, stoners, athletes, cheerleaders, all but two of my teachers, car collectors, sports fans, smokers, drinkers, adults who hadn't gone to college, religious believers, especially Christians, liberals, conservatives, moderates, people bored by philosophy, anyone who didn't play Dungeons and Dragons, people who played Dungeons and Dragons without staying in character, dungeon masters for Monty Hall campaigns, people who didn't like classic literature, anyone who planned to major in math or science, people with low savings rates, people who were too cheap, gays, guys with girlfriends, punkers, proto-goths, people who worked with their hands, fans of Cheech and Chong, people with low IQs, and girls who dated anyone on the preceding list. I was, in short, a teenage misanthrope. Why was I such a misanthrope? If you asked me at the time, I probably would have said, because almost everyone is terrible. If you asked me, well, why is it so terrible to be any of these things? I guess I would have simply added, people who challenge my misanthropy, to my list of antipathy. Fortunately, virtually all of my misanthropy has melted away with age. I can honestly say that, on a typical day, absolutely no one upsets me. This is partly because I've constructed a beautiful bubble for myself. The main reason, though, is that I've learned the wisdom of tolerance. Yes, most people are very different from me. Yes, I have little in common with most people. But why should I expect anything else? How other people live their lives is their business, not mine. If I could go back in time, what would I tell my misanthropic teenage self? Roughly the following. In many cases, you're just being silly. Say, oh, it's so horrible for someone to play Dungeons and Dragons incorrectly, or oh, it's so awful to dislike opera, without laughing. Can't do it, can you? In many cases, people can't help being the way they are. People don't choose to have low IQ. So understanding rather than contempt is in order. 3. What about serious character flaws that people can help? For the most part, people are the main victims of their own character flaws. So just leave them alone and perhaps they'll learn. 4. You have a serious character flaw that you can help, misanthropy. And for number 3, you're the main victim of your own flaw. Most people are totally unaware of your antipathy, even though your antipathy makes you unhappy every day. Put down your load of resentment and you'll feel a lot better. 5. Once you fix your misanthropy, you can focus on improving your life. Be constructive all day, every day. Focus on how to avoid unpleasant experiences, not who to condemn. Take all the time you spend ruminating on everything you don't like and spend it doing something you do like. If you really think that only 1% of people are worth talking to, search for the 1% instead of lamenting their scarcity. If you're pleasant to everyone, you'll have a much larger pool of potential friends to choose from. Then you can enjoy life instead of complaining about it. Would my teenage self have found my current self persuasive? Yes, actually. I learn slowly from experience, but quickly from explicit argument. Given 20 hours of conversation with a wiser version of myself, I would have abandoned misanthropy years ahead of schedule. Oh well, better late than never. May 1, 2013.